Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Female Deku Was Told She'd Never Get a Quirk. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details, and go to the story link to say hi to the author. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Dark green waist-length grass brushed against the 6-year-old's legs as she walked. Flowers covered the ground around her, and the scent of them filled the air. The light green All Might onesie doing nothing to protect against the cold. Whimpering, the teary-eyed girl clutched the stuffed rabbit she was holding tighter. Bruises from Katsuki's latest assault covered her small arms. Stumbling, she fell down onto the dirt. Low growls reaching her ears. Spinning, she shoved herself back as glowing golden eyes came into view. Her back hit a tree, stopping her from running away. Whimpering, she closed her eyes as the creature came closer. Feeling a hand touch her cheek, she gasped, her eyes snapping open. Golden eyes stared back at her from a face that looked almost the same as hers. The two girls could have been twins, if not for the silver hair that flowed down the other girl's back, and the fluffy wolf ears poking out of her hair. "Cute," Izuku whispered, reaching up to touch the other girl's ears. They were soft under her fingers. The pleased moan that filled the air surprised her though. Blinking, she tilted her head to the side, asking, "Who are you?" "I'm your Quirk," she said bluntly, mirroring Izuku's confused head tilt. When she spoke, Izuku caught sight of the pointed teeth in her mouth. Reaching out, she poked the girl's cheek. Pouting, the silver-haired girl swatted her hand away. "But the doctor said I didn't have one," Izuku said softly. Hope echoed in her voice. If she had a quirk, then maybe her dad would come back. The girl across from her rolled her eyes before tapping Izuku's nose. "And you think he knows more than me?" she snapped, sounding irritated. Her golden eyes narrowed at the thought of the doctor. "I guess not. What's your name?" Izuku asked, grinning at the other. Leaning forward, she noticed the other girl look down, her face turning red. Immediately realizing the issue, Izuku asked, "Are you waiting for me to name you?" Nodding slowly, the other girl looked suddenly vulnerable. Izuku tapped her chin as she stared at her quirk thoughtfully. Eyes widening in wonder as a name flashed through her mind, she grabbed the other girl's hand, saying, "Frost. Your name can be Frost." 8 years later, Izuku still couldn't get over her quirk's strangeness. Sitting in class behind Katsuki, she listened to the teacher with only partial attention. She was so bored. The villain attack this morning hadn't been anything special, but it was exciting to see Kamui Woods in action, even if only for a moment. Even if that had led to Frost commenting that he reminded her of a tree, and that they could use fire against him. As if burning the hero to death was the proper thing to do. "I'm bored," Frost whined, the words echoing through her mind. Eyes flickering to Katsuki, Izuku decided to tune out the teacher. "Me too. What are we doing tonight?" she sent back. The mental communication allowing her to hear Frost's groan. "Sparring, unless you want to let me take over tonight," she replied, sounding almost excited for the opportunity. Izuku winced. "Last time I did that I had to wipe my browser history," she said, the annoyance in her voice plain for the other girl to hear. "Come on, Izu, please," Frost asked, almost begging. She was so bored, plus her instincts were driving her to play with her other half. "Only if you promise to stay on age-appropriate sites," Izuku said, trying to bargain. Walking up to find her browser history full of mature content wasn't something she wanted to see. Frost growled in annoyance, the sound echoing through both their minds. Frowning, her ears flattened against her head as she pouted. "You're no fun." "Oh, and incoming," she said lightly. Izuku twitched, feeling the desk beneath her hands explode. Wincing, she rolled away from the blast, her back hitting the wall behind her. Staring at Katsuki's still smoldering hands, she groaned internally. "Deku, what the hell do you think you're doing applying to the hero course when you're quirkless?" he ranted. Izuku winced, but not for the reason he thought. She hadn't told anyone about her quirk. After her father left, she never saw the point in trying to change people's opinions on who she was. Instead, she decided to work toward becoming a hero. If they couldn't see that she had a quirk, then she wouldn't spell it out for them. It was kind of sad that she managed to fool everyone into thinking she was useless. Well, everyone but him. Katsuki had noticed the change in her immediately. And eventually, he had a run-in with Frost while she was in control. To say that their first meeting was explosive was an understatement. After that, she told him about her quirk, and ever since he'd been pushing her to announce it to the world. But she wasn't willing to do that. Not only did hiding it gives her an advantage, but she wanted to keep Frost safe. Her other half was the most important thing in the world to her. She wasn't going to risk her by announcing it to the world. Hearing his jaw clench, she pressed her back against the wall. Her quirk didn't just allow the two to switch who was in control, it also gave her superior senses. I have to try, she said softly. He growled, sounding even more feral than Frost. He didn't understand why she wanted to hide behind a weak persona. Opening his mouth, he was about to yell at her when the class behind him started laughing. Minor explosions went off in his hands as he turned and started shouting at them for interrupting. Izuku sighed once his attention was pulled away from her. Standing, she made her way to the singed desk as the teacher tried to regain order. Katsuki glanced over at her, frowning. Her pale skin contrasted with the dark green and black hair that fell over her shoulders. But that wasn't what he was focusing on. Satisfied that he hadn't injured her, he sat back down, drawing all the attention in class to himself. Laying her head down on her desk, she waited for the day to pass. Frost had decided to take a nap, so her other half wouldn't be very much help. Closing her eyes, she followed her quirk's lead. 2 hours later, Katsuki was shaking her shoulder to wake her up. His usual minions were waiting outside the school. Watching her wake up, he wondered just what their relationship would be like if he'd never found out about her quirk. Bakugo, is there a reason you tried to wake Izu up? Frost asked, standing from the cramped desk. He followed her movements as she stretched. Yawning, she turned her golden eyes to him, letting him see who was in control at the moment. If the third-person reference hadn't been a big enough hint. Popsicle, he said, causing her eye to twitch. Narrowing her eyes, she growled at him. The nickname wasn't something she liked at all. Careful, wouldn't want to lose an eye, she snapped. He scoffed, knowing that she wouldn't actually do anything. Smirking, he looked into her eyes, still finding it weird seeing golden eyes on Deku's face. Can I talk to Izuku? He asked. Frost tilted her head before closing her eyes. When she opened them again, he was looking into emerald green. He sighed, saying, I really wish you would just tell everyone about your quirk. Izuku winced before beginning to gather her bag. Her hair fell over her face as she worked, hiding the indecision she felt. She knew that next year she would be forced to tell the teachers at UA her quirk. But all her life people put her down because they didn't bother to see if the rumors were true. No one asked her if she had a quirk, instead they just assumed she didn't. After being hurt so many times, she didn't want anything to do with those people. Her own father left because he didn't want a quirkless daughter. Zipping up her bag, she tensed when he reached out, grabbing her hand. Meeting his eyes, she noticed the concern in them. He could rant and rave all he wanted, but his eyes never lied. It was the only way she could read him. Forcing a smile that she was sure he knew was fake, she used her other hand to push her hair away from her face. Just wait until we get to Yua Kaken, she pleaded. He nodded, releasing her slowly, but never taking his eyes from hers. Frost cooed at the concern he showed, causing her face to heat up. He's adorable, Frost said, and Izuku wanted to kill her. Sighing, she tuned out her other half's cooing in favor of watching his concerned look turn into a smirk. He already knew how much of a menace Frost could be. Stepping away from her, he started for the door. The only goodbye he gave her was a wave. Picking up her bag, Izuku left the building. She had to head home, get changed, then head to the cafe for work. She wanted to save enough money to get herself another jacket. Frost had spent most of her money ordering her own jacket. Something that Izuku was still upset about. Listening to Frost hum in the back of her mind, she rolled her eyes. You're annoying, Izuku snapped as the two walked down the street 10 minutes later. The shadowed overhead pass was coming into sight, meaning she was almost home. Hearing Frost laugh, she sighed. The girl hadn't shut up about finding a boyfriend. Izuku didn't really understand why her other half wanted that, but she didn't care. Frost looked for strength while she looked for personality. None of the boys she knew had any sort of good personality. Plus, they were all weak. Katsuki's not, Frost whispered, her tone teasing. Izuku blanched. Throwing the other girl a mental glare, she wanted to puke. He's like a brother, she shot back. While Frost laughed at her, she blocked her out. Reaching the darkened area, she sighed as the sun stopped beating down on her back. Stretching her arms above her head, she wondered if her mom would be upset if she took a few extra hours at work today. Hearing something behind her, she stiffened, her instincts roaring to life. Spinning, she jumped to the side, dodging the slime-like hand that crashed onto the ground where she'd been standing. Landing, she could hear Frost growling. The sludge-like blob was laughing as it threw its arm forward again, trying to catch her. Stumbling back, she tripped. Frost screamed her name as the slime closed in around her. Thrashing, she struggled against the liquid holding her. Ignoring the words of the villain, she felt like the air was being forced from her lungs. Vision darkening, she heard Frost begging her to stay awake. She saw a flash of yellow before the world around her ceased to exist. All Might tapped the girl's cheek. The guilt he felt over arriving so late wouldn't allow him to leave her laying on the ground. Izuku groaned, her eyes opening slowly. Seeing the large man hovering over her, she yelped, pushing herself away from him quickly. Her heart pounded in her chest so quickly that it almost hurt. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Izuku took a deep breath, trying to bring herself under control. Finally recognizing him, she gave a slow nod. Mentally reaching out, she felt for Frost. She found her still raging. She looked up just in time to see him about to leave. But she had so much to ask him. She didn't want to just let him leave. Acting on instinct, she reached out, catching the leg of his pants as he took off. All Might almost screamed when he looked down and found the girl clinging to his pants. Making for the nearest roof, he choked, blood coating his lips, as he felt his time beginning to run out. Smelling the blood, Izuku felt guilty for causing him issues. "Sorry, I just wanted to ask you a question," she said, unable to meet his eyes. All Might sighed, about to tell her to continue when he started coughing. Smoke rose off his body, revealing his smaller skeleton-like form. Rushing forward, she helped him sit down despite the shock running through her. Frost whimpered, the smell of blood and pain coming off him like a wave. It hurt her nose. Izuku pushed away the instinctive urge to run away. "Not your fault," he whispered, pain running through his body as he passed his limit for the day. It was obvious from the frown on her face that she didn't believe him. Frost was silent for once. Izuku frowned. She could smell the blood on him, and she hated the scent. It clung to him like something dark and powerful. All Might startled at the way the girl's eyes flickered to gold for a second. "What was the question?" he asked softly despite the pain he was in. Izuku sighed. "Is it possible to be a hero without using your quirk?" she asked, ignoring Frost's annoyed growl. Her other half knew why she was asking. The possibility that maybe they could keep their quirk a secret was enticing. "I don't think so. Being a hero is dangerous, and using your quirks is part of the job," he said firmly. Izuku frowned. She'd know it, but still, after years of keeping Frost a secret, having to share her with anyone was strange. Looking away from him, she sighed, her hands clenching as Frost cooed in her mind. "At least now I get to come out to play more," Frost stated, looking forward to being in the open more. "But you'll be in more danger," Izuku said softly. It hurt to know she would have to put her friend in danger. Frost had been the only friend she had until Katsuki figured out the truth. "Izu, I know you're trying to keep me safe, but hiding who we are isn't going to last," Frost said, knowing that they would have to fight at UA, and that holding back would be an insult to both them and their opponent. "You're my best friend. I just don't want to put you in danger," Izuku argued. "I'm your offense, Izu," Frost stated, leaving no room for arguing. They were two sides of the same coin. Frost was the offense and Izuku was the defense. Yet they were both better together. Watching the silent conversation, All Might wondered just what was going on in that head of hers. The silent girl seemed to be wearing with herself. Finally, she nodded slightly, agreeing with Frost's words. If she wanted to be a hero, then she couldn't hold back. "Will you be okay?" she asked softly. The older man nodded, pushing himself up. Izuku watched him go with a sigh. Why couldn't things just be easy? Gripping the strap of her book bag, she turned away from the rooftop, deciding to head home. There wasn't anything else she could do at the moment. Hearing an explosion, she glanced back. Part of her wanted to go see what was happening, but did it really even matter anymore? The connection she had with Katsuki went wild. Fear filling the bond. Pushing herself forward, she clung to the railing for a moment. Her instincts going wild as Frost took control instantly. Her pack was in danger. Narrowing her golden eyes, the girl spun around. The bond between her and her packmate leading her down the stairs and through the streets. In the back of her mind, she realized that they were heading in the direction of the villain attack. Clenching her teeth, she held back a growl. Skidding to a stop just behind the crowd, she froze. Fear belonging to both of them filling her veins when she realized just who was holding him captive. Green slime encircled his body, holding him in place despite the explosions he was sending at it. Frost could hear Izuku whimper inside her head, and it brought her back to reality. Staying still wasn't going to help him. The fact none of the pros were doing anything caused her to growl. The animalistic sound causing some of the fellow watchers to flinch away from her. Fear showed in Katsuki's red eyes as he glanced in her direction. It was too much. Heart pounding in her chest, she moved without thinking. Bolting through the crowd, the girl ignored the hero's calls for her to come back. Throwing her bag in its face, she reached for Katsuki. The boy's fear-filled eyes met hers. Grabbing his hand, her eyes flickered between green and gold as the two halves of her both screamed out for him. Seeing his eyes roll back in his head, She clawed at the slime with her other hand. Hearing the villain say something, she ignored him, not caring if she got hurt. Feeling a hand clamp down on both her and Katsuki's hands through the slime, she felt her eyes widen. She barely saw All Might before the force of his punch caused her to lose consciousness. Bakugo groaned, opening his eyes slowly. At first, he was confused. Glancing around, he sat up on the pavement. Rain pounding down on top of him. Tightening his grip on the hand held in his, he followed it to the girl laying beside him. Memories ran through his mind. "Deku, you idiot," he snarled, almost crushing her hand in his. Hearing her groan, he bit his lip. Izuku's green eyes fluttered open, letting him know which one was currently in control. Looking up at him, she had less than a second before he was holding her up by her shoulders and shaking her, saying, "Stupid fucking Deku, did you even think? You could have been killed, you idiot." "Sorry," she whispered. Scoffing at the weak apology, he let her go as the pros began to walk over. Shrinking under their attention, she looked down. Noticing her discomfort, he released her shoulders and took the hero's attention. Gathering her stuff, she snuck away while they were focused on him. They didn't even notice. Frowning, she crossed her arms. Frost was growling lowly in her mind. "We were weak, Izu," Frost said darkly. Now that she had a moment to think, her pride stung. Izuku sighed, knowing what her other half meant. "It's to be expected. Our quirk doesn't really work against things like that," she said, trying to calm down her other half. The growling stopped as Frost thought over her words. She could admit their quirk wasn't equipped for taking on slimes. "Still, we could have died. Bakugo was right. Charging in was stupid," she said, but there was no regret in her voice. If anything, she sounded more amused. Izuku's lips twitched into a small smile. Walking home, she thought about what she was going to tell her mom. It was a given that the woman would find out about her stunt. Paling at the thought, she sped up slightly. Taking the back alleys home, she scented the air. A familiar scent caught her attention as All Might stepped into her path. Looking at the man, she heard Frost whine in her head. Funny how quickly her more primal side had grown attached to the man. Seeing him cough again, the scent of blood grew stronger. Eyes flashing gold, she frowned at him. "You smell like blood," she said bluntly. Wincing at her tone, he met her eyes. "Yes, well, that tends to happen when you're missing half your stomach," he said without humor. Frost flinched, her eyes widening. In her head, she felt Izuku cry out in shock. Keeping her silence, she circled around him. Letting her study him, he did the same. The eye thing told him she had a duality-type quirk, and her comment about his scent told him she had enhanced senses. Clearing his throat, he asked, "Do you want to be a hero?" Frost stilled. Staring up at him, she could see the strength in his eyes despite his physical condition. Nodding slowly, she watched him without fear. "I can make you a hero," he offered. Crossing her arms, she tilted her head to the side, curiosity in her eyes. "Why?" she asked, confused and curious about his offer. No one believed she could be a hero except Bakugo. Even her mother doubted her. "You charged into that fight without hesitation to help your friend. That is exactly what being a hero is about," he told her. Eyes changing to green, she grinned at him. "I accept your offer. My name's Izuku Midoriya," she said, extending her hand as her eyes changed back to gold. Smirking, she said, "And I'm Frost." "Toshinori Yagi," he said, shaking her hand. "Yay, my first fanfic outside of the RWBY category. This was supposed to be out on the 7th, but got delayed by poor internet connection. What do you guys think? I do not own MHA." Frost knew Izuku was trying her hardest to get stronger. Ever since Toshinori had told them about One for All, Izu had been training so she would be ready to inherit it. The good thing about Toshinori, though, was that he wanted to get to know both of them, not just Izu. It was why she was almost fond of him. Almost, she didn't trust him at the moment. Stretching, she turned her golden eyes on him. She didn't understand why he would help them. Their own father wanted nothing to do with them after they were discovered quirkless by the doctor. Something she was still angry about. Bending her knees, Frost lunged forward, her hand missing as Toshinori sidestepped. Growling, she twisted, attacking again. They'd finished their training to prepare for One for All last week, and were now training on how to use it. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, Izu stated when Frost failed once again. "Fuck you," Frost snapped back. The startled laugh she got from Izu made her roll her eyes. Sizing up Toshinori, she watched him flex his arms. Eye twitching, the more aggressive of the two lunged again. The second he sidestepped, she reached out her hand. Grabbing the side of his shirt, she acted. Pulling herself up, she sent a kick at his face. Grabbing her ankle, he ripped her grip away from his clothing and sent the girl flying. Landing roughly on the sand of the cleared off the beach, Frost huffed. Well, that was fun. She just loved being tossed around like a rag doll. Great job, Izu teased. Scowling, Frost narrowed her eyes. She had to catch him off guard. She doubted he would let her get close without an opening. Sitting up, she narrowed her eyes. How does one catch the number one hero off guard? Izuku followed her other's half's thought process before smirking, saying, use the Katsuki thing against him. Sharing the smirk that her other half was wearing, Frost stood up slowly. Once they did this, there would only be an instant. Just one chance to get in a hit and win. Tilting her head back, she met Toshinori's eyes with her own, saying, I'm going to tell Katsuki about One for All. Shock colored the older man's eyes, and she moved. Green lightning arched off her body as she vanished. Appearing behind him, she tapped him on the shoulder, as he was lost in his own world of shock and disbelief. Landing on her feet, Frost smirked amusement in her eyes. The light touch snapped their teacher out of his mind, and he turned with a glare on his face. Despite the intimidating aura he was giving off, she never lost her amused expression. Frost, please tell me you're joking, he said once he realized she wouldn't back down. Nope, as our best friend he deserves to know, she said. Patting him on the shoulder, she left the pro hero behind in favor of getting home in time to change for dinner. Pausing as she remembered what her mom said, she turned, calling, Mom wants you over for dinner tonight. If possible, the man deflated even more. Since knowing the two girls, he'd been over to their house several times, and the growing crush he had on their mother was well known to them. Watching Frost walk away, he sighed. She was right, as their best friend Bakugo had a right to know about his heir's quirk. He just didn't like that she wanted to tell him. The blonde boy was a bully to everyone, even Izuku and Frost. How could someone like that be considered her best friend? Letting Izu take back control, Frost decided to take a nap. She was getting tired. It strained them to stay switched for so long, especially since they were training. The thing that both of them had noticed, though, was that One for All increased the amount of time they could stay switched. Other than that, they hadn't noticed anything different about their quirk. Stretching her arms above her head, Izu looked up in time to see Katsuki round the corner. The look of slight panic that crossed his face caused her to raise an eyebrow before sighing as he spun around to walk the other way. She knew he was avoiding her at the moment, because she wouldn't tell him why she'd been training so hard. The silent treatment was worse than the explosive treatment. Narrowing her eyes, she lunged forward, green lightning arching around her as she shot forward. She overshot. Yelping, the girl crashed into his back, sending them both tumbling down onto the ground. Katsuki growled as he hit the ground hard, the shock causing him to groan before realizing that she was still on top of him. Annoyance flashed through his eyes as she rolled off him. Do that again, and I'll fucking blow you up, he snapped. Izu could hear Frost laughing in her head as she watched him sit up slowly. Sorry, I overshot it, she said softly while diligently ignoring Frost's laughter. Playing with the hem of her shirt, she looked down at the ground when he glared at her. She might not be afraid of him, but a glaring Katsuki was still intimidating. Hearing him scoff, she glanced up as he started to stand. Almost panicking, she reached out her hands, grabbing onto the leg of his pants before he could leave. Katsuki felt his hands twitch and barely resisted lashing out. Taking a calming breath, he looked down at her. Seeing the hostile expression on his face, she winced before saying, I think we need to talk. You made yourself clear last time, he said softly. If he was yelling at her, then at least she might stop feeling guilty about pushing him away. Soft-spoken Katsuki was weird and reminded her of a kicked puppy. A very aggressive kicked puppy that may or may not be a sadist. Frost snickered. Seeing her amusement, he dropped the pouting expression. Tilting his head, Katsuki smirked before offering her his hand, saying, I knew you couldn't survive the silent treatment. Don't be smug, she snapped, her eyes flashing with exasperation. When his expression didn't change, she sighed and took his hand, letting him pull her up easily. You're the one who fell for it, he said, letting her go. Rolling her eyes, Izuku scoffed, trying to ignore Frost's snickering. Raising an eyebrow, he waited for her to calm down before saying, This is the part where you tell me the big secret. It didn't take long to explain her new quirk to him, of course. He only believed her after she activated One for All. She winced when he stayed silent. Seeing the gears turning in his mind, she waited for him to yell at her or announce that they were no longer friends. She could feel Frost's nervousness and knew that if she tried to say anything, it might come out wrong. Katsuki had known something was different about his friend. Frowning, he wondered why she was the one chosen. In terms of raw power, he was stronger than she was, by a far margin. If All Might wanted a strong successor, then he should have chosen someone much more powerful than Izuku. The fact he didn't mean that All Might wasn't just judging based on raw power. Izuku must have stood out in some other way for her to be chosen. But how did she do that? A flash of gold mixed with green ran through his mind, and he couldn't help but narrow his eyes, his mind returning to that day weeks ago when she saved his life. Terror had been written across her face, but she still rushed in to keep him safe. Compassion. All Might picked her because of her compassion. Slowly a smirk drifted across his lips, surprising Izuku and sending shivers down her spine. Taking a slight step back, she winced as he chuckled. "Can we run now?" Frost asked, completely serious. "Even if we did, we wouldn't get very far." Izuku said, her lips twitching upward when she saw amusement light up his eyes. "Let's test your quirk," Katsuki announced. Grabbing her hand, he began dragging her toward the beach she'd just left. Frost burst into laughter, her voice ringing through Izuku's head. Wincing at the sound, Izuku allowed him to pull her along. Katsuki felt his amusement grow when she walked along behind him without a fight. No matter how much Izuku tried to hide it, there was a part of her that loved sparring with him. Kindness was only a small part of who she was, and sometimes it could overshadow the viciousness that lay inside her. Frost was the personification of that violence. But she wouldn't even exist if that didn't already exist in Izuku's heart. Standing across from her on the sandy beach, Katsuki felt himself smirk. Fire rushed through his blood, and he couldn't stop his fingers from twitching. Without hesitation, he rushed toward her as the green in her eyes sharpened into brilliant gold. Ducking around his punch, Frost grabbed his wrist and threw him over her shoulder before twisting and sending a kick at his downed body. Rolling out of the way, Katsuki caught sight of the wild grin on her face. Toshi watched from afar as they danced around each other. Both of them knew what the other was going to do before they actually made the move. As if they were reading each other's minds. A soft smile spread across the pro-hero's face as he caught sight of the joy on his successor's face. For the first time, her guard was down and Frost was allowing her golden eyes to show emotion. Still, it would be a long time before she could match those at the top. Passing the entrance exams would be easy, but after, her life would only get harder. Seeing Katsuki set off an explosion in her face, Toshi watched with narrowed eyes as she grabbed his hand without hesitation and redirected the attack. Ignoring the heat, she slammed her palm into his stomach before kicking at his chin. Sidestepping, he tackled her to the ground. Frost whined as her arms were pinned to the sand beside her head. The victorious smirk written across his face caused her to pout. "No fair," she whined, causing him to laugh. At least he was still stronger than her, as if sensing his thoughts. Frost growled. "What's wrong, Popsicle?" he asked, an innocent expression appearing on his face. Izuku burst into laughter. His face in no way matched how he really acted. Feeling her lips twitched, Frost tried to hold back her own laughter. When he tilted his head to the side slightly, she failed at keeping it back. Katsuki grinned as the girl below him began to laugh, the action causing her golden eyes to brighten. Getting off her, he sat on the sand beside her, watching her in amusement. Toshi felt his eyes widen at the sight of his student's joy. He'd never seen her this happy, as if the armor around her heart had fallen away to reveal the little girl trapped inside. Frost slowly got herself under control and sat up. Seeing the soft smile on his face, she tilted her head, a wicked grin appearing on her face as she opened her mouth to tease him. Before she could speak, Izuku took control. "Does this mean I'm forgiven?" she asked softly. Katsuki tilted his chin up as his red eyes looked down at her. "Never keep secrets like this from me again," he warned before pushing himself up off the sand. Lips forming a wide smile, she nodded in agreement. "Are you coming over for dinner?" she asked, leaning back on her hands. Nodding, he offered her his hand once again. Taking it, she let him pull her up, but didn't let go. This time their roles were reversed as she pulled him toward her house. The scent of food hit her nose when they were a few feet from her door, causing her to speed up. Behind her, Katsuki smirked, amusement lighting up his red eyes and softening them just a bit. It didn't last long. Entering the house, he sneered, seeing the skeletal man, who'd been handing around Izuku, setting the table. "Mama, I brought Kaken," Izuku announced as if she'd felled a mountain. Her mother smiled, causing Toshi to blush, something that the two children noticed, then pretended not to have seen. Dinner wasn't very eventful, except for the small glares sent at Toshi by Katsuki. The skeletal man had even shifted away from the blazing red eyes when Katsuki let out a small, almost inaudible growl. Izuku wasn't ashamed to admit she wanted to laugh at him. Frost had no such reservations. She'd been laughing at the man since he walked into the door and greeted their mom with a blush and stutter. Feeling her lips twitch, she looked down at the table. Katsuki didn't like this guy. Narrowing his red eyes when the man turned his attention to Aunt and Co., he sneered. Stiffening when Izuku's hand brushed across his arm, he watched as the girl gathered the plates before vanishing into the kitchen. Pushing away from the table, he sent one last glare at the blonde man before following her. Izuku yawned, holding her hand over her mouth. Feeling her eyes drop slightly, she leaned back against the counter. Frost was already half asleep. They wouldn't train tonight, it seemed. She had hoped that with the boost One for All gave them that she might be able to fully manifest her other half. Sadly, it hadn't happened. She'd failed to give Frost her own body, just like she'd failed her father by getting a quirk too late. It seemed like all she did was fail. Dad was an ass, Frost said softly. Wincing at the words, Izuku silently agreed that he had been. Despite that, he was their father, and she had to wonder. If he knew she had a quirk, would he come back home? Would he love them? Frost growled, the sound shaking Izuku out of her self-pity, just as Katsuki tapped her head. Blinking up at him, she tilted her head curiously when a bit of nervousness entered his eyes. Most people wouldn't notice it in his eyes, but she saw it. "Can I stay over tonight?" he asked, causing her to raise an eyebrow. Scared to sleep alone, she teased, her eyes turning gold as Frost came out to play. "Don't be a fucking brat," he snapped, trying to ignore the way his face heated up slightly. Frost laughed, her eyes lighting up with mirth as he rolled his eyes. She'd always had fun teasing him. "Yes, you can stay," she said, a grin appearing on her face. When he nodded, she sighed, asking, "So, after we get to UA, you're going to have to come up with a new nickname for Izu." "Deku is a perfectly good nickname," he said, just to annoy her. Frost growled at him in warning as he smirked at her in amusement. Before she could yell at him again, he said, "I'll just call her Izu." Frost stared at him, her eyes widened in shock. She'd expected a strange nickname, but instead, he'd decided on something completely normal, and the personal nickname she had for Izu. A shot of jealousy ran through her blood, and she couldn't hold back the protective growl that escaped her lips. "Pick something else," she ordered coldly. It was a mistake. The second the words left her mouth, he grinned, the expression lighting up his eyes. Inko frowned when she heard arguing from the kitchen. Sighing in exasperation, she shut the door behind Toshi as he left before heading off to deal with the kids. Her frown quickly faded when she saw Frost poking Katsuki in the chest and threatening him with bodily harm. Her golden eyes gave away the enjoyment she was taking from being able to play with him like this. Smiling, the woman watched them tease each other back and forth. When Frost first appeared, she'd thought of contacting her husband. Instead, she sent him divorce papers. She'd also given the Bakugo family custody over her daughter if anything happened to her. Izuku and Frost were her world. Despite Katsuki's crude tones and attitude issues, he would keep her daughter safe. Although she doubted he would be willing to if Frost didn't stop riling up his temper. "All right, that's enough," she said, cutting in before Frost could dig into his pride. Pouting, her wolf-like daughter stalked past him to go get ready for bed. Turning to look at Katsuki, who was staring after her with irritation, she asked, "What was that about?" "Frost didn't like me calling Izuku Izu," he said, a taunting smirk slipping into place on his face. A startled laugh was pulled from the woman's throat before she could stop it. He tensed when she ruffled his hair. "You know he didn't mean anything by it," Izuku said, trying to calm down her other half. She could still hear Frost growling, even an hour later when they were laying down to sleep. The running shower told her where Kaken was, and she knew that Frost was still angry with him. "He doesn't get to call you Izu, only I do," Frost stated, and she could hear the irritation in the other's voice. Sighing, she rolled her eyes at the girl's childishness. "Kaken was just playing," Izu whispered, her eyes dropping slightly as the shower in the other room cut off. "Good night, Izu," Frost said, letting it go. Curling into her blankets, the girl fell into sleep. She didn't even stir when Katsuki laid down beside her. Her eyes snapped open when she felt something brush against her on the bed hours later. The sound of whimpers drew her attention while her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Sitting up slowly, she frowned as Katsuki clutched the pillow tightly. Soft whimpers dropped from his lips as he clenched his eyes shut tightly. Reaching out for his shoulder, she hesitated. Logically, she knew Kaken would never hurt her on purpose, outside of sparring. But at the moment, he was vulnerable. Biting her lip, she changed direction, her fingers drifting through his hair as she hummed softly to calm him down. Slowly, he untensed, the clinging grip on her pillow loosened until it faded almost completely. Frost let out a content sound as Izuku slowly laid back down beside him. Curling against him, she closed her eyes when his arms wrapped around her, blocking the staff coming at her head. Izuku twisted, lashing out with a kick at her other half. Frost laughed, her golden eyes filling with amusement as she moved out of the way. Leaping away from Izuku, she tossed her staff away, transforming mid-leap. Paws hitting the ground, the wolf snarled before charging. Although the smirk on her face did dull the aggression just a bit. Izuku rolled her eyes at Frost's actions. striking the ground with her own staff. Izuku vaulted over the wolf's head. Releasing her staff, she twisted so she could keep an eye on the wolf. Landing behind the wolf, she grabbed Frost's dropped weapon and used it to block the jaws trying to clamp down on her shoulder. Frost snarled, pulling the staff from Izuku's grasp. Tossing it in the air, she transformed back. Catching the staff with one hand, she swung at her other half. Rolling under the swing, Izuku pounced. Frost yelped as her staff flew from her hands. Falling to the ground, she rolled her eyes. Grabbing Frost's wrists, Izuku pinned the other girl to the ground. Laughing, Frost flipped them over so she was on top before wrapping her arms around Izuku's neck and hugging her tightly. Frost, Izuku complained, squirming as her other half nuzzled against her neck like a puppy. When the white-haired girl refused to move, Izuku gave up. Laying still, she allowed herself to become a pillow. Entrance exams are today, Frost whispered. Izuku nodded. The UA entrance exams were something they'd been working together toward for the last 10 months. They were stronger than they were before meeting All Might. Much stronger. One for All had also settled now, and they had partial control over it. Although Frost was much better at using it than she was, Izuku still couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. A month ago, Toshi had deemed them ready for his quirk and passed it on. It was an experience she never wanted to have again. Seriously, who shoves their hair in a person's face and orders them to eat it? Putting her teacher's weirdness aside, having the man around had been a boon. Frost had even reluctantly admitted that he was Pack. Of course, there was the chance that One for All would enhance their own quirk. At the moment, she hadn't really noticed anything. Closing her eyes, Izuku relaxed against her other half. Her mom would be coming to wake her up soon. Taking the time to rest wasn't something she'd been able to do lately. They would get into UA and become a hero. Nothing would change that. Yet she was also afraid of how her classmates would respond to Frost. Having a dual personality was rare among quirk users. 2 hours later, she was standing outside her house waiting. Frost was still snoozing. The black jacket she was wearing was different than her usual style. She wore it for her other half. Seeing as how they would have to fight, she wanted Frost to be comfortable. The sleeveless light blue shirt was more her speed through the black pants, and dark green boots were all Frost. Hearing footsteps, she turned. Katsuki was walking toward her, his eyes meeting hers for a second. The fiery determination in them made her smile. "Ready?" she asked when he walked by her. He never stopped or asked her to wait for him, but she doubted he had any issues with her following. If he did, then the street would be nothing more than scorched rubble. "I fucking dare anyone to get in my way," he said, a dark smirk crossing his lips. Glancing at the girl who'd fallen into step beside him, the golden wings embroidered on the back of her jacket glinting in the early morning light gaining his attention. They'd spent the last month training together. The truth of One for All was something she'd shared with him. For that he was grateful. Especially since the quirk gave her the added ability to fight against him. What did make him curious was the bag slung over her shoulder. It was a small messenger bag, and if it carried what he thought it did, then he couldn't wait to see her fight. Walking through the gates to the school, she marveled at the sight of it. Yua was amazing to look at. Beside her, Bakugo seemed almost annoyed with all the people surging around them. Narrowing his eyes, he considered snapping at them when someone turned in their direction. Scoffing, he turned his attention to Izuku when she almost bounced in place. The reserved girl's eyes were wide with excitement. Watching her look around, he rolled his eyes. Tapping her shoulder, he motioned for her to follow. He didn't want to waste time at the gate. Blinking out of her stupor, she followed after him, letting an amused smile spread across her face. The speech they had to listen to from President Mike after entering the building told them about the entrance exams. Hearing about the robots, she couldn't help but hum in interest. Touching the bag on her shoulder, she didn't notice Katsuki's amusement. It was a shame the two of them wouldn't be able to fight together. "You brought that, didn't you?" he asked, causing her to jolt. The words weren't loud, but enough to get the attention of several people around them, including the dark red eyes of the boy sitting directly behind them. "Yeah," she whispered. Tugging on her connection with Frost, she smiled when her quirk jolted awake. "I'm awake," Frost announced, although she still sounded sleepy. Izuku giggled. Hearing it, Katsuki knew Frost was talking. When a boy in the front stood up, it drew their attention. Izuku didn't care much about what he was saying. The boy seemed stiff and out of place at the moment, which Izuku thought was more due to nervousness than anything else. Tilting her head, she shifted her eyes to Mike when the man explained about the 0-point robots. "And would the two in the back stop talking so loudly?" the boy said. His tone sounded scolding. Listening to him point out them having a conversation pissed Katsuki off. Growling, he wanted to blast the glasses off the boy's face. Izuku winced, drawing in on herself in a way he hated. Looking down at her hands, she let her face go blank. An old defense mechanism from when they were kids. Admittedly, he'd caused her to develop it. When they stood to go get changed and head to the exams, her face turned scarlet. She'd forgotten to bring a change of clothes. Wincing, she looked over at Katsuki, who was watching her in amusement. "Forget your change of clothes?" he asked, resisting the urge to laugh. She nodded slowly. She'd been so busy thinking about her quirk this morning that she hadn't thought to get a change of clothes. I'll fight in this," she said softly. The outfit would still allow her to fight. When the boy from before walked past, she flinched. Looking at the floor, she leaned away from him. If only for a moment his attitude had reminded her of the bullies she'd had to deal with. Katsuki sighed, starting to leave. He couldn't help but pat her shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her eyes brighten again. Still, he wanted to punch the glasses-wearing boy in the face. Izuku wasn't good with people at all. Most of them judged her based on her quirkless status, something that wasn't true. Others, however, went after her because of her attitude and small stature. Those that did nothing to help her were sometimes worse, since they just watched. Standing outside the closed gates, she tugged off her bag, pulling out the short rod of metal from within. Holding the bag in her hand, she wondered what she should do with it. The bag still held her phone and a roll of bandages. Leaving it lying around would be foolish. Plus, she hadn't brought any clothes to change into, so leaving it in the locker room would be weird. Pondering what to do, she glanced toward the pro heroes standing on top of the gate. Taking a deep breath, she tried to emulate Frost, who at the moment was thinking over schemes for the robots. Walking forward, she ignored the boy who'd called her out completely when he tried to talk to her. Keeping her back straight, she held back the nervousness that haunted her steps. "Present Mike," she called, gaining both his attention and that of the students around her. Surprised that her voice didn't shake, she blinked when the man stepped off the gate. Stepping back, she put distance between the two of them when he landed easily. Leaning down to face her, he grinned in a way that reminded her of Kakin. "What's up, little listener?" he asked brightly. It was refreshing to meet a prospective student that wasn't afraid of him. Heart beating rapidly at how close he was to her, she reddened. "I was wondering if you could hold on to this for me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grinning, he nodded, taking the bag from her hand. Catching sight of the metal in her other hand, he wondered what it was for. There was nothing against the students bringing in support items or weapons. "Sure, kid," he said. Smiling, she blinked as he moved away before she could thank him. Looking toward the gates, she ignored the whispers around her in favor for the one in her head. "Good job, Izu. You managed to talk to someone who isn't an explosive idiot," Frost cheered. Izuku ignored the teasing tone, instead choosing to look down at the weapon in her hand. "Think this will be good enough?" she asked, referring to the quality of metal. Buying one offline meant it might not be as durable as ones made by Hero Support. Frost hummed, her own skepticism showing. It might not be good enough to use for long, but all they had to do was make it count. "They're robots, so use the blades," Frost ordered. Nodding silently, Izuku flinched when the announcement to begin sounded. Green lightning from One for All arched over her body as she shot forward. Clicking a button, the rod, she felt it extend, becoming a thick 6-foot-long staff. A sharp metal spearhead rested at the end. "Frost, cut loose," she ordered, switching with her other half. Eyes glowing gold, a wicked grin stretched across her lips. Her speed was her greatest weapon. Ducking under one of the robots, she twisted her spear, cutting through the metal and wires underneath. She didn't bother to keep score in her head, knowing that Izu would do it for her. In fact, she could hear her other half counting already. Spinning around another robot, she lashed out her leg, breaking the metal and sending it flying. She was having fun. Being let out to play like this was exhilarating. Izu almost never let her out to play. Unless it was sparring with Bakugo. But then their spars dissolved into taunting matches. Tracking another robot that was ganging up on another examine, she changed her grip on her spear. Throwing the weapon with the force of a train and the speed of a bullet, she wasn't surprised when it shattered, the metal being no match for her throw. Shrugging with disinterest, she watched the robot fall back, a hole in its torso. Leaping forward, she thrust her palm into another's back, watching it crumble as she broke it. These things were almost too weak for her to actually play with. One for All helped their fighting a lot, the quirk giving them enough power to tear through the robots. Still, as she scented the air after catching the hint of blood, she frowned. Almost too much power not to get drunk on it. Reining in her bloodlust, she glanced around, trying to find the scent. Ignoring the mock villain appearing behind her, she bolted. The first thing she noticed was screaming. The examines running away from the giant 0-point robot. The brown-haired girl stuck in the rubble was more of a concern, however. Shooting past the others, Frost kicked off the ground. Trying to save the girl wouldn't do any good if they were both crushed, so taking out the robot was the best option. Her eyes glowed a mixture of green and gold as she slammed her fist into the robot. It shattered. Falling, she planned on stopping her fall at the last minute, but something felt wrong. Looking at her hand, she was shocked to see a bone sticking out from her arm. Body sparking green, she twisted, trying to spin so that her feet were near the ground. But it wasn't working. Closing her eyes, she winced when something impacted her cheek. Blinking, she realized that she'd stopped falling. The brown-haired girl was panting as she stopped her savior's descent. Palms slightly red, the girl smiled in victory before quickly covering her mouth. Blood still ran down her cheek from the small cut on her face. Quirk no longer working, she dropped the green-haired girl. Landing in a crouch, Frost glanced at her arm, while the girl took a moment to throw up beside some rubble. The adrenaline would be wearing off soon, and she really didn't want to deal with the pain. Frowning, she switched out with Izu. Izuku frowned as her other half went to take a nap. Her arm hurt, and she knew Katsuki would be angry she got hurt. Then he would proceed to growl while she healed. Like an angry puppy who wouldn't be able to go for a walk. "I can't believe you're leaving me to deal with this," Izuku snapped. Frost winced, covering her ears. Holding back a whine at the pain, she shut her eyes, trying to think of happier things, like cats. God, she was going to have to quit her job, wasn't she? The thought causing her to wince. She liked her job. Something wet touched her cheek before the pain she was in vanished, leaving her exhausted. Opening her eyes slowly, she jolted, flinching back so far that she bumped into someone's legs. The old lady standing in front of her just chuckled, amused with the child. Still, such an extreme reaction couldn't be a good thing. Getting over her initial fear, Izuku said a small thanks to the woman, already knowing who she was. Recovery girl smiled, walking away to treat more injuries as Izuku stood up. Running a hand over her arm, she was glad not to be injured anymore. Now Katsuki would never know. Smirking at the thought, she wondered if he had finished his test yet. Hearing the announcement to head home, she moved toward the gate quickly. Vanishing into the crowd, she didn't hear the brown-haired girl's cry of thanks. Taking her bag back from present Mike, she smiled. "Thanks for doing this," she said softly. There wouldn't be much time until Katsuki tracked her down. Slinging it back over her shoulder, she covered a yawn with her hand. She was exhausted. Even Frost was choosing to turn in for a nap. Blinking, she wondered if she would even be able to get home before falling asleep. "No problem," he said, ruffling her hair. The action caused her to freeze for a moment. Blinking, she tried to pat down her hair as Frost burst into laughter. The shocked look on her face vanished when she heard Katsuki calling for her. So strange, when usually she was the one finding him. "Yo, finish your test, Deku," Katsuki called, his voice cutting over the noise of the exiting students. Pushing through the crowd rudely, he came to stand at her side. There were cuts along his arms, most likely since he wouldn't have allowed anyone to heal them. The pro-hero frowned at the boy's actions. The rudeness not sitting well with him. Plus, the nickname grated on his nerves. "You're hurt," she said, grabbing his hand gently. He calmed slightly, allowing her to inspect the injuries for herself. "That's what happens when you explode a fucking robot," he said, grinning. Pride lit up his face, and she couldn't help but smile back. Staying still, he allowed her to wrap the bandages around his arms without a fight. She was the only one he would allow to touch him. Seeing the pro's look, he growled, asking, "What the fuck is your fucking deal?" "Kakin," Izuku scolded, tightening the bandage just a little too much. Wincing as it rubbed against one of the cuts, he scowled, not at all buying the innocent look she plastered on her face. Glaring at the pro-hero, he held back his growls as the man laughed at him. Scoffing, he looked away, turning his attention to Izuku as she finished tying his bandages. Giving the two kids one last amused glance, Mike headed off toward the faculty room. He was eager to see the recordings of the exam. "Are you injured?" he asked, looking her over silently. Although she was covered in dirt, she didn't seem to have any physical injuries. Shaking her head, Izuku quickly covered her mouth to hide another yawn. Raising an eyebrow, he tapped her on the head, a smirk appearing on his face when her eyes changed to gold. Frost growled at him, her eyes on the finger he'd used to tap her with. The threatening look on her face was nothing to him. Looking her in the eyes, he said, "So victory dinner at my place or yours when we get in?" "Mine. No offense to your mom, but she can't cook," Frost said, matching his smirk with her own. Izuku sighed as the two dissolved into bickering as they walked home. "Hi, thanks for reviewing, everyone. Also, yes, Katsuki was having a nightmare." The cat ear headband on her head tilted as she pushed open the kitchen door into the rest of the cafe. The cat-themed cafe was filled with bickering patrons. Izuku set down the slice of cake in front of one of them with a smile before reaching up to straighten her headband with a pout. Gliding between the tables with grace, she went back to the kitchen. The place was usually slower in the middle of the day, meaning that she would be able to relax in about an hour and take a break. Adjusting the belt on her dark red skirt, she frowned. Despite its flaws, she loved her job. It was calming to have something that she could do, although it did tend to get stressful at times. She'd been teased about her job before by her bullies, something that she hated with a passion. Leaning against the wall, she watched the chef dance across the kitchen. This was something she chose to do, and having them come here and mock her for it had been horrible, even though she hadn't done anything she'd wanted to. In the end, letting them get away with it had been the easier thing to do. Well, on her end, Frost had been furious. Katsuki had actually attacked them. Taking off her cat ears, she rubbed the soft fake fur between her fingers. So much was happening so fast. Yua would be starting in less 2 days. She would have to be in a room full of strangers, which was for the best considering all her other classmates were sadists. Stupid sadists at that. It was surprising they'd known how to tie their shoes with how little intelligence was between them. Izu, I'm bored, Frost said, gaining her attention. She wanted to take Izu's mind off of Yua for a bit. Her other half has been stressing about their first day for the last week, and she was getting tired of trying to calm her down. We're working, Izuku said, placing the cat ears back on her head and ignoring Frost's slightly insulted growl. Why, we won't have time to soon, she pointed out, trying to resist taking control and destroying the offending headband. That's why this is our last day, Izu said. Forcing a smile, she took the plate from the chief. The worried look he sent her didn't really help her at all. Passing one of the other servers, she ignored the way the older woman's eyes lit up with worry. Still, Frost complained. Do you want money to buy that dagger set or not? Izu snapped, cutting off her other half before the girl could say another word. Fine, Frost said, the pouting tone giving her away. She liked pointy things more than she probably should. Retreating into Izu's mind, she kept one eye on their connection. The field of flowers she'd met Izu in hadn't changed much over the years. The once sunny sky was permanently encased in twilight, leaving an eternal sunset to shine over the white and green roses that had taken over the place. Every so often a bright yellow or red rose would spring up. Stalking forward, she bypassed the flower field, heading toward the darkened forest surrounding it. While Izu was the light, Frost was the dark. The dark towering trees represented Frost perfectly, while the twilight sky represented her other half. Each tree represented a connection to her, just like every flower did the same with Izu. Sadly, there were only 4 trees engraved with names. Stopping, she ran her fingers over Katsuki's name. She knew they were getting close to materialization, but something was missing. Like a wall keeping them trapped inside. If they could break down that wall, then she knew they would be able to become a great hero. She felt like she was failing Izu. The girl tried so hard to keep a smile, but she could feel the disappointment through their connection. A quirk was supposed to be useful, but the only thing she'd done was make her wielder feel useless. She wanted to get stronger to support Izu, and she'd thought one for all might be the way to accomplish that. Yet the only thing that happened was them gaining strength. It was as if she couldn't do anything right. Sighing, she sank to the ground, her back leaning against the tree as she brought her knees up to her chest. The white wolf ears on her head dropped down as she hid her face. They had to get stronger. Her instincts were screaming at her that they weren't good enough yet. Closing her eyes, she tried to get some sleep. Izuku shed the cafe uniform in favor of a pair of gray shorts and a black tank top. Zipping up her green hoodie, she bounced in place for a moment. The fluffy wolf ears on the hood made her feel closer to Frost. Her last paycheck was hidden in the pocket of her shorts as she slipped on her shoes and started to leave. Waving goodbye to her boss for the last time, she vanished out the side door. The sky was darkening already, and she had to hurry if she wanted to get home before dinner. Hearing a thud, she froze, her eyes widening. Quieting her footsteps, she peeked around the corner. Light yellow hair almost glowed in the dark of the alleyway. A boy was shoved against the brick wall by another. His hair was darker than Kaken's, but the way he stood tall against 4 bigger assailants reminded her of him. Even though she could see his shoulders shaking, he was trying to be brave. Frowning, Izuku reached out to Frost, waking her other half up. Bumping into us was a mistake, you little brat. What, talk more, because that would be horrifying, the boy asked, trying to bluff his way out of this. Shifting his eyes nervously to the side, he cursed his mouth for leading him into this situation. Why couldn't he just apologize and leave it at that? The rage lighting up the bully's eyes was all the warning he got before the boy raised his hand. Tensing, the blonde braced himself, the lightning in his blood surging as he raised his hand to defend himself. You little she. Eyes widening, the boy leaned back on instinct when a black-shoed foot impacted the bully's face. The taller boy yelped while his 3 minions blinked in shock. Landing easily, Frost smirked amusement in her eyes as they watched her warily, all her frustrations coming to the surface as she almost bounced in place, excitement flashing through her eyes. "I thought I said not to cause a scene," Izu said. The exasperated tone did nothing to stop Frost from picking her next target. Ignoring Izu completely, her other half rushed forward. Yellow eyes tracked her movements as she danced around the taller boys. It was easy for her to outmaneuver them, and it was obvious that they didn't have any formal training. Grabbing the wrist of the black-haired boy about to punch her, she twisted her foot, impacting his knee and sending him to the ground. Kneeling, he could do nothing to stop her elbow from ramming into his temple. "Wow, Denki Kaminari, that was amazing," the boy said. Carefully stepping over the body of one of the fallen thugs, he noticed her golden eyes fade to green as her face heated up. Looking down at the ground, she didn't see the first thug Frost had kicked in the face start to stand. Launching off the ground, the thug flicked his wrist, revealing the knife in his hand as he aimed at her back. Eyes widening, Kaminari reached out his hand, grabbing her wrist and pulling her behind him as he kicked the guy in the chest. Releasing her wrist, he followed the kick with an electrified punch that caused the thug to screech. Izu stared as the thug fell to the ground groaning, while Frost raged in her mind, her other half wanting nothing more than to take control and kick the guy around some more. He'd tried to stab her, a 15-year-old girl, just because she'd beaten him in a fight. Frankly, at the moment, she was almost willing to allow Frost free rein to deal with him. "Dude, trying to kill a pretty girl, what the hell, man?" Kaminari snapped, stepping away from the unconscious thug. Despite the situation, Izuku couldn't stop her face from warming again. Frost calmed immediately, an amused scoff sounding in her mind. Tilting her head, Izuku couldn't help but almost laugh. "You didn't have to do that," she said, gaining his attention. The blonde rubbed his neck nervously, his lips spreading into a wide smile. "Well, you saved me, so it was only fair," he said. Nodding slowly, Izuku tilted her head, while Frost giggled softly. Playing with a black streak in his hair, he watched her nervously. Izuku smiled slightly. He was nothing like Katsuki. Less aggressive, that was for sure. Smiling, he said, "Besides, as a future student of US Hero course, I couldn't let a pretty girl get hurt." "All he thinks that we would have gotten hurt," Frost cooed. Feeling her lips twitch, Izuku knew that he'd gained Frost's approval. "Frost, be nice," Izu scolded. The playful tone made Frost smirk. "I am being nice, you're the one ignoring him." "Seriously, you haven't even given the boy your name yet," Frost teased, amusement in her voice. "Want me to introduce you to?" Izu asked softly. Frost frowned. While the boy had gained her approval slightly, if he was going to Yua, then she didn't want him to know about her yet. Secret weapons were supposed to remain a secret after all. "No," she said. Izu wasn't surprised at the answer. Her other half was thinking tactically instead of emotionally. Besides, this boy wasn't Katsuki, and no matter how much he'd amused them, she wasn't going to trust him so easily. "I'm Izuku Midoriya, nice to meet you," she said, offering him her hand. Shaking her hand, the boy beamed at her. She honestly thought the expression was adorable in the cute puppy way. Hearing Frost laugh in her mind, she doubted the boy would have much fun once her other half decided to introduce herself to him. The teasing he would go through at her expense would most likely never end. It was nice that her other half accepted him so easily despite being so guarded around new people. "How does your quirk work?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, curiosity driving away her usual need to distance herself from people. If Frost liked him, then he couldn't be too bad. "I shock people with electricity," he said, although the excitement from before was sort of dimmed when he said it. Shaking his head to drive away the nervousness, he asked, "So what's yours? I know your eyes changed colors, but that can't be all right. Keep me a secret. I want to see the look on his face when we finally manage materialization," Frost ordered. Resisting the urge to roll her eyes, Izuku smiled as a teasing edge entered her eyes. "You'll have to wait and see," she said, mischief lighting up her face. When his eyebrows furrowed in confusion, she said, "You're going to Yua, right? We might be in the same class, and I'd hate to give you an advantage." Kaminari twitched, his eyes narrowing for a moment as he processed her words. So she would be at Yua too, and probably the hero course if she was unwilling to tell him her quirk. He could let it go, especially since she was cute. Opening his mouth, he was about to speak when her expression changed. Feeling her phone buzz in her pocket, Izu stilled, her eyes widening. Was she late? Kaminari blinked as the girl pulled out her phone, staring at the message she'd received for a moment. There was panic in her eyes. "Sorry, I've got to go." My mom wanted me home for family dinner tonight, and I might be late, she said, a smile passing by her face before her eyes flashed gold. Rushing off, she didn't notice the disappointment in his eyes. Frost sighed at her other half's actions. Izu got reckless when she was flustered. Katsuki rolled his eyes as Izuku rushed into the house, nearly knocking over his mother, as the woman sent a quick curse over her shoulder. Scoffing, he watched his mom roll her eyes before sitting the plate he'd been carrying on the table. Their congratulatory dinner was about to start, and she'd almost been late. If he'd been forced to deal with his parents alone, he might have run away screaming. He hated dealing with his parents alone. Watching Toshinari stumble around his aunt, he snorted before turning away to follow Izuku to her room. Staring out her window, she held the acceptance letter to Yua in her hands. They were both going to high school together, just as they'd went to the same schools since they were born. Saying nothing, he leaned against the doorway. Izuku knew this was all she'd wanted for so long, and she was happy about finally being able to go to her dream school. Yet what if she wasn't good enough? During the exam, she'd overused one for all and broken her arm. There was still so much that she didn't know. What if she wasn't able to learn fast enough? Her fighting style needed work too. Materialization was a slow-moving snail, and fighting Keiken only led her to learning his style of fighting. Although the number of times she'd been blown up did give her a high pain tolerance, which she wasn't going to tell her mom about. Then there was the issue of classmates. Kaminari aside, she didn't know how they would react to Frost. Would they accept her or hate her? If you tear up the letter, it might make you feel better, Katsuki said. The white paper in her hands had been crumpled in her grasp. It was already threatening to be torn apart by her nails. Blinking, she dropped the letter back onto the desk and sat on her bed. Sitting down beside her, he relaxed when she leaned against him. I still can't materialize Frost, she said. The soft words filled with annoyance and a little desperation. Something was missing, like a blank space in a math problem. Every time they tried, it was as if they were skipping something. Thank God, he mumbled. Hearing him, she twitched, annoyance flashing through her eyes at the same time that Frost growled at him. Poking him hard in the stomach, she didn't feel the least bit guilty when he growled at her. Glaring at the green-haired girl beside him, he thought about snapping at her, but rolled his eyes instead. Something's missing. Whenever I try to materialize Frost, it's like we hit a wall we can't break through, she whispered, deciding to ignore his comment. Katsuki frowned. He knew the two had been working on materialization for almost a month now. Frost wanted to be able to act independently of Izuku, while Izuku wanted Frost to have more freedom. Personally, he didn't know how he'd deal with Frost having her own body. He already knew it would be hell, but he wanted to fight her without the fear of injuring Izuku in the process. Plus, if he was able to smack the smug look of the wolf's face, then he'd be happy. Try to find the missing thing before going further with materialization, or you'll hurt yourself, he said. Humming, she considered his advice. It would be hard to find what's missing if she doesn't even know what she's looking for. As if sensing her confused frustration, he said, if all else fails, I could just throw explosions at you until Popsicle decides to come out and play. Sighing, Izu retreated to her mindscape, while Frost took control. She would have to trust the two not to destroy her room. Fuck you, Frost growled, her golden eyes glaring up at him. Sneering, he ruffled her hair, knowing it would annoy her. The flash of anger in her eyes was all the warning he got before she was lunging for his neck. Hearing a thump from upstairs, the adults shared an exasperated look. Inko sighed, leaning back against the couch, as she simply listened to the growls coming from upstairs. Seeing Toshi fiddle nervously, she patted his shoulder, trying to reassure him. They're fine, she said softly, a smile forming on her face. When he still looked worried, she said, play fighting isn't something we've ever been able to break them out of. At the worst, all they'll have are some minor bruises and scrapes. He probably said something to annoy Frost. Toshi nodded, but the worried look never left his face. He just hoped they didn't start playfighting at Yua. Although the mental image of them rolling around on the floor of their homeroom class like puppies did make him smile. Hesitation marred her face as she touched the large door in front of her. It was warm to the touch, but she couldn't fight down the nervousness she could feel. Even her other half was nervous. This wasn't the same as fighting Katsuki on the beach, or holding her tongue when her classmates called her a fool. This was the first step to the rest of her life. For the life of her, she couldn't think of anything more than her fear. Feeling Katsuki's hand come down on her shoulder gently, she startled. Glancing up at him, she noted the worry in his eyes that only she could see. Nodding slowly, she stepped to the side, allowing him to lead the way into their new classroom. For the most part, it was empty. A boy with white and red hair sat in the back, and a girl with black hair stood at the front, her eyes nervously watching the door. Izuku noticed her look down quickly when they entered. Stalking to his seat, Katsuki took note of the other two, but ignored them soon after. Sitting down behind him, Izuku stifled a yawn. Dropping her bag onto the desk, she used it as a pillow. The sensation of someone poking her on the head drew her attention to Katsuki, who was looking down at her with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. It was a strange expression. Sighing, she rolled her eyes as he began petting her hair. The action causing Frost to make a contented sound as they worked together to take in the scents around them. There was an Arctic scent coming from the back that reminded her of frozen blackberries, while a peach scent came from the girl up front. Frost memorized them slowly, making sure that she wouldn't forget either of them. Smelling something that reminded her of engine exhaust, she opened her eyes slowly. The boy who yelled at them before the practical exam. Sitting up, she tensed as he made his way toward them. Seeing her stiffen, Katsuki followed her gaze. The growl that left his lips startled the people around him. The girl up front twitched surprise, coloring her eyes, while the multicolored boy narrowed his eyes. The tall boy came to an abrupt stop. "Kakin," Izuku said. Her soft scolding gained everyone's attention. Stilling, the blonde glanced at her before nodding. Leaning back in his seat, he put his feet on the desk and tried to relax. Frost chuckled her amusement, causing Izuku to smile softly. Standing, she offered the taller boy her hand, saying, "Hi, I'm Izuku Midoriya, and this is Katsuki Bakugo. You can call me Izuku." "I am Tenya Ida. You may call me Ada," he said. Shaking her hand, he felt the blonde boy watching him closely. Frowning slightly at the rush of guilt he felt, he said, "I'm sorry about what I said before. It was unfair of me to single you out like I did, and I feel truly." "Okay," she said, cutting him off. Yanking her hand from his, she leaned away from him. The entire time he'd been speaking, the boy had been getting closer to her. It wasn't something she appreciated. Hearing a snarl, Ida tensed his eyes, flickering to Katsuki, who glared right back at him. For a second, the boy reminded him of a guard dog. This time, Izuku didn't even try to stop her friend, as he started a pointless argument with the taller boy. She knew he was taking the attention off of her, and she appreciated it greatly. Frost was ranting about personal space in the back of her mind, and she'd already classified Ida as someone who was not packed. Sighing, she stood tapping her fingers 3 times against her desk to let Katsuki know she was going to get some air. Stepping out of the classroom, she leaned against the door, her eyes closing. They were finally here. The thought was enough to bring a small smile to her face. After years of biting her tongue, they could finally show the world what they could do. The only issue was dealing with classmates who didn't hate her. It was strange to be in a room with people without dealing with animosity. Hearing Ada begin yelling at Katsuki, she walked back into the classroom. Her friend was clearly teasing the taller boy. Katsuki had a habit of finding the most uptight person in the class and starting fights with them. Straightening, she walked down the hall, her eyes studying the amazing view given to her by the wall of windows. She wasn't nervous about having to fight. It was socializing that drove her insane. Katsuki's rabid attitude was more social than her anxiety issues. Narrowing her eyes slightly, she sighed. There was so much she had to work on. A smell like green tea caught her attention as a blonde boy bumped into her back. Jolting, Izuku stumbled forward as the boy took a step back. The stack of textbooks he was holding threatening to topple to the ground. "I'm so sorry," she said. The words coming out in a rush as she hurried to help balance the stack of books. Sending her a small smile, he shook his head slightly. "It's fine," he said. Peering at her over the top of the books, he wondered what class she was in. This was the hall for Hero Course students, so she had to be an aspiring hero. Not to mention she was a first-year student like him. A charming smile spread across his face as he said, "I'm Nido Monoma. Feel free to call me Monoma. I would shake your hand, but I'm unable to at the moment." "I'm Izuku Midoriya. You can call me either of those," she said softly. The amused glow in his eyes didn't fade as she spoke. Just as she was about to offer to help, she heard an explosion. It was Katsuki. She knew it was. Quickly giving him a polite goodbye, she rushed to save the poor fool who'd drawn her packmate's ire. Re-entering the classroom, she didn't see the way his eyes darkened. Katsuki had his feet on the desk arguing with Ida, who seemed unable to understand the explosive boy was toying with him. Noting the new faces in the class, she felt a little happy when she saw Kaminari watching the chaos with a grin. She was glad the boy was in her class. Walking over, she stopped just in front of Katsuki, accidentally drawing Kaminari's attention to her. "Oh hey, you're the pretty girl that saved me," Kaminari said, drawing the attention of everyone in the class. Katsuki frowned at the words. Narrowing his eyes, he almost dared the boy to step closer to her. Staring at the boy, it didn't take long for Katsuki to decide that he didn't like him. Not just for his stupid hair either. The nickname he'd picked for Izu grated on Katsuki's nerves. It sent every protective instinct he had into overdrive. He didn't want playboys around his little sister, especially when she decided to let Frost remain hidden. "And you saved me at the practical exam," the brown-haired girl said. Shrugging her shoulders, Izuku shifted uncomfortably as the two began peppering her with questions. Twitching slightly, Katsuki growled, gaining their attention. Izu had never been very good when she was faced with being the center of attention. "Calm the fuck down, you fucking idiots," he snapped, taking their attention from his friend. He knew that she hated being crowded. Unaware to all of them, a short boy with grape-like hair was reaching out his hand, aiming for her unprotected backside. Both of them turned to him with arguments on their lips when Izu yelped. Jolting forward, she almost ran into Kaminari, her face turning bright red as snickers came from where she was standing a second ago. Kaminari stiffened as she almost completely hid behind him. It took Katsuki less than a second to figure out what happened as he looked between the girl and the perverted grin on the grape-haired boy's face. Eyes narrowing dangerously, he leaned forward, his body preparing to pounce. Stopping in place, he stared past the commotion at the man watching them from a yellow sleeping bag of all things. "You little foo." "Popsicle," Katsuki snapped, cutting her off before she could begin her rant. Enraged golden eyes turned on him, and he flickered his eyes behind her to the man laying on the floor. Forcing herself to calm, Frost threw one last glare at the boy before taking her place behind Katsuki. While she would love to pound the little brat into the floor, she wanted to make a good impression on the teachers. Allowing Izu to regain her control, she decided the boy had made an enemy today. "If you're here to make friends, you're in the wrong place," Aizawa said, the warning in his voice catching them all off guard. Frost bristled, a low growl echoing through their connection. She didn't like his tone. Even though he couldn't hear it, Katsuki tensed, sensing the change in his friend. It took all his self-restraint not to look behind him to see what color her eyes were right now. Stepping out of his yellow sleeping bag, which Izu personally thought looked like a banana, he ordered them to change into their gym outfits. Standing slowly, Izu sighed. She had no idea why Frost didn't like their new teacher, but she guessed it had more to do with him showing up right after the grape kid decided to get handsy. Unlike her, Frost could be vengeful, and she doubted her other half was very happy about not being able to pound the brat into the floor or punt him out one of the many windows. Following the other girls to the locker room, she caught the scent of peaches when the tall black-haired girl from earlier brushed past her. This time, however, she was able to smell the subtle hints of cocoa that intertwined with it. Frost calmed slightly, leaving Izu to roll her eyes in amusement. It didn't take long for them all to change into their gym outfits. Izu was mostly happy to get rid of the skirt that went with the uniform. "Hey, it's Izuku, right?" the brown-haired girl from earlier asked, drawing everyone's attention. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm Ochako Yoraraka," she said, holding out her hand for Izu to shake. Blinking, the green-haired girl shook her hand. The introduction somehow opened a floodgate, as the girls all scrambled to introduce themselves to each other. Keeping a hold on Izu's hand, Yoraraka pulled the smaller girl into the group with a smile. Katsuki growled at nearly everyone that came close to him, the glare on his face tightening even more as he stomped his way over to the grape-haired insect that had dared to touch his sister. As if sensing him coming, the boy paled considerably. Shuffling from side to side, he looked for somewhere to hide. Seeing Kaminari, the boy hid behind him, redirecting just a little of Katsuki's rage to the other blonde. "If either of you ever touches her, I'll break every bone in your fucking body before turning you into shrapnel," he threatened. Kaminari winced, trying to step back as the grape-haired boy shoved him forward. Feeling a hand on his shoulder, Katsuki turned his head with a growl. Red eyes filled with apprehension and concern stared back at him. It caused him to pause. The red-haired boy simply stared at him for a long moment. The hand on his shoulder felt warm, and for a second, it caused him to relax. His instincts were telling him that this boy was the same as Frost and Izu. Plus, he was good to look at, so that was something he liked. "I think they get the message," the redhead said. Unable to hide the smirk creeping across his face, Katsuki moved away from the two pale boys. Subtly running his eyes over the redhead's chest, he offered his hand. "Katsuki Bakugo," he said. It took everything in him not to let out a purring growl when the boy grinned at him. "Eijiro Kirishima," he said. Taking the blonde's hand, he didn't notice the intensity in the boy's gaze, or the two shuffling out of the boy's line of sight. Walking away, he pulled on his shirt before motioning to the door, asking, "Ready to go then, Bakugo?" Nodding, he walked out the door, feeling the boy fall into step behind him. Izuku was waiting outside the locker room, trying to tie her hair back. Amusement lit up his eyes as he snatched the hairband from her hand before quickly braiding her hair. The girl sighed in relief. Touching her hair, she sent him a small smile. Her eyes were already filled with exhaustion. Deep in his mind, he knew her issues with making friends was his fault. The other kids they grew up with had only followed his lead in abusing her. Even if he'd stopped, it had already been too late to change anything. Seeing her here trying to make friends without allowing herself to run away made him hate his 4-year-old self. Smiling, he patted her head. There was no way he would let her know how he actually felt. Hearing the boy behind him shift, he turned his head, pinning the redhead with his gaze. The boy froze, staring between the two in front of him. Turning back to Izuku, he pointed at the boy. "Izu, this is Kirishima," he said. Izuku blinked, glancing at Kirishima as he scratched the back of his neck nervously. Katsuki had called him by name. Her packmate didn't do that unless a person impressed him, or he was fond of them. She had to wonder which of the two this boy fell under. Shrugging, she decided it didn't matter. If Katsuki trusted him, then she would too. "Nice to meet you, Kirishima," she said. Offering him her hand, she sent him a calming smile. The boy grinned at her. Katsuki felt his lips twitch upward as he led the two away from the locker rooms. He wanted to know what their new teacher had in store for them. The fact the man had managed to enter the classroom so quietly that not even Frost had noticed worried him. It meant the man was a stealth hero, someone that Izuku hadn't studied. Frost was impatient. Her entire form was tense as she paced Izuku's mindscape. She knew who their teacher was, and she was worried. Eraserhead, the man who could erase quirks. They had two, and while it wouldn't be so bad if one for all was erased for a moment, she was an integral part of who Izuku was. She was connected to everyone they'd claimed as pack. If she was erased, it wouldn't be pretty. Even now, just within range of smelling that man, she wanted to either attack or run away. Izuku was nervous too, even if Bakugo's new pet was distracting her. Huffing, she stopped pacing. Standing still, she let her form ripple until she was standing as a human instead of a wolf. She would not allow that man to erase her. She would never leave Izu. If he tried, then she would tear him apart. "Are you okay?" Izu asked softly. The words caused Frost to growl. No, she wasn't okay. Sealing away her emotions from Izu, she forced herself to calm down. Taking out her anger on her other half wouldn't help either of them. When Frost didn't answer, Izu frowned. She was worried about Frost. The other girl hadn't been the same since their teacher arrived earlier. Frost had never been this angry before, and it worried her. Even with her closing off part of their connection, she could tell her other half was afraid. Still, there was nothing she could do to make Frost feel safe. She wasn't strong enough for that. Feeling Katsuki pat her shoulder, she came back to reality as their teacher called the class to attention. The makeshift obstacle course they were standing on made her feel slightly lost. Staying close to him, she felt Kirishima step into place on her other side. "Here's how this is going to go. You'll all do the tests, and the one who gets the lowest score will be expelled from the hero course," their teacher stated. The outraged shouts that followed his announcement contrasted with the vicious glee that lit up Katsuki's face. He loved a challenge, and their teacher had just issued one that made his whole body ache with anticipation. Some like Kaminari and the grape-haired boy paled. Tapping her finger against her arm, Momo narrowed her eyes. This was obviously some kind of incentive for them to work harder. Surely Yua wouldn't employ a teacher who would expel a student on the first day. Catching Todoroki's eyes from where she was standing, she followed his gaze to the shaking Bakugo. For a moment, she thought it was fear until the girl beside him rolled her eyes. "Bring it the hell on. I'll ace every test you throw at me," Katsuki shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the class. Stepping forward, he met their teacher's unimpressed stare with his own. There was no way he would back down when he was so close. He would win and be the best. Izuku smiled, the tension in her shoulders falling away as she watched her packmate accept the challenge their teacher had thrown at them with open arms. Reaching out to her other half, she asked, "Do you want to help with the tests?" "Not really," Frost said. She didn't want anything to do with their teacher. "Lazy," Izu teased as she followed Katsuki to the first test. "Izu, if you let me out right now, I'll commit murder," Frost said. "Right," Izuku whispered. Letting the matter drop, she turned her attention to the trials in front of her. Without Frost to control one for all, she had to do it herself. The next 2 hours were filled with her having to constantly make sure she didn't go over her limit, while also staying ahead of some of the others. Every so often, she'd feel eyes glaring into her back. Ignoring everyone completely, she focused on passing these tests. She wouldn't fall behind the others. Crashing down to the ground after the long jump, she panted, her eyes closing for a moment. Feeling something cold touch her nose, she jolted, her eyes shooting open. Kaminari grinned down at her as he shook the cold water bottle in her face. Returning his grin with a small smile, She took the water bottle and let him pull her out of the way. Sitting beside him, she waited for the others to finish as she emptied the water bottle. Aizawa ran his eyes over the students in his class. Most of them had potential, and from what he'd read of their files before class, they all had the grades academically to at least enter the general studies course if he expelled them. Most of the students didn't realize the little loophole in his speech. They were all so focused on becoming heroes, they didn't realize he said the course and not the school. Even if he expelled them here, they would only fall to the general studies and have to work their way back up. There were some who he found himself unable to even think of expelling. Katsuki Bakugo, despite the foul temper and attitude, was clearly talented. His quirk would be useful for fights, but not so much for rescue operations. The boy would have to curb his temper if he even hoped of advancing in his chosen career. No one would trust him when all he did was growl at people. The 2 recommendation students were also safe from expulsion. Endeavor would burn down the school, literally, if his son didn't get in, and Momo Yaoyorozo quirk had too many uses. Both had unbelievable potential, and even Tenya Ida didn't compare to the multitude of uses the 2 brought to the table. In all honesty, most of this class had the potential to be great heroes. Except for 2. Minta's quirk wasn't very useful unless he became an infiltration hero, and his longing for fame wasn't something Aizawa was willing to indulge for too long. Plus, if what he'd seen during his time spying on his class was brought into effect, the boy was a complete pervert. The other was more complicated. Despite how well Izuku Midoriya did on the practical, her quirk still caused self-harm. He wasn't willing to stand by and watch his students throw themselves into a fire without caring if they got burnt. Recklessness got heroes killed. He didn't want to watch his students die. No, both Minta and Midoriya would be expelled today. The girl could drop into the general studies class and have time to master her quirk. The only issue was how well she was doing today. Unless he baited her into doing something foolish, he couldn't see a way to make her drop this course. Pushing his hair back from his face, he told the students to lie up for the final test. He would cut his hair, but if he did, his lover would kill him. Watching the girl come to a stop beside Bakugo, he tossed the softball in his hands to the blonde boy. Katsuki raised an eyebrow as he caught the tossed ball. Stalking forward, he listened to their teacher explain the test with only half his attention. The only important part was how far his quirk could make the ball fly. Using full power, it would go pretty far, but he didn't want to risk messing up his arms so early in the year. So about 90% should be enough. Watching Katsuki scream die at the top of his lungs, Izu couldn't hide an exasperated sigh, while Frost began laughing. Most of the class simply watched him in shock as the ball vanished into the atmosphere. The expression of pride on her packmate's face did nothing to hide his annoyance at not being able to use his full power. His arms just wouldn't hold up against the kind of strain it would require, especially not since he'd used his quirk almost constantly today during the other tests. "I think your friend might be insane," Kaminari whispered as he leaned closer to her. Scoffing, she quietly thought he had no idea. Katsuki was a battle fanatic, a show-off, and most importantly an attention-getter. He loved proving he was better than anyone else. This was just him announcing he was aiming to be the best in the class. Sending Kaminari a smile, she watched as the rest of their class take their turns. As Katsuki shifted beside her when Uraraka got an infinite score, he couldn't hide the interest in his eyes when he watched the brunette return to the group. Stalking forward to take her turn, she closed her eyes, letting Frost take over. Looking down at the softball in her hand, Frost smirked. Time to see if she was better than her packmate at something. Pulling back her arm, she threw. Her eyes stuttered to green as the ball left her hand. "I do not own My Hero Academia, I do own Frost." He'd always been worried about how docile Izuku was compared to her other half. As her brother, it was always his job to look out for her, even if he'd forgotten that for a while. Frost he'd never worried about because of her ferocity. It almost matched his, but Izuku was different. While he could argue with Frost all day long, and the girl wouldn't back down, Izu would. She wasn't very good at conflict, usually relying on Frost to fight her battles. That's why the hollow feeling in his chest hurt so much right now. When Frost had claimed him as pack, she'd made a connection between them that couldn't be severed. But it was gone. Even if only for an instant, and it hurt. Seeing Izu fall to her knees gasping, he snarled, the sound echoing around him in the sudden silence. The only thing holding him back was the look in her eyes. Sure, he'd seen Izuku mad before, but it was always golden eyes that glared. Frost was the one who thrived in aggressive situations, not Izuku. So then why was the look in her eyes so similar to her other half? "Deku, stop ignoring me already," he shouted. Banging on her door, he frowned. His mom had sent him to get her for dinner. Pouting, although he would never admit it, he pushed down his worry. Rocking on his feet, the 6-year-old knocked on her door again. Narrowing his eyes, the boy opened the door without caring what state she would be in. He was hungry. Deku was standing near her open window staring out at the street below, as if she'd never seen it before now. Sneering, he stalked forward, his hand reaching for her shoulder when she turned. Golden eyes stared back at him with a fury that she'd never had. Stumbling back, he didn't even realize he was moving until his back hit the door, causing it to slam shut. Jolting, he barely had time to blink before her hand was curled around his collar. Snarling, Frost ignored Izu's pleas for her to stand down in favor of keeping him pinned to the door. He'd hurt her, every day. He'd treated Izu like she was nothing. The rage she felt was visible in her golden eyes. "Where's Deku?" he snapped as his fear turned to anger. Grabbing her wrist with his hand, he glared at her, unwilling to look away. He was worried. No matter how hard he tried to hide it, he cared about her Izu. Katsuki Bakugo cared about Izuku Midoriya. She could see it in his eyes. Releasing him, she covered her mouth to hide her laughter. Still holding onto her hand, he stared at her before realizing that he was being laughed at. Snarling, he lunged at her. Without her paying attention, it was easy to tackle the girl to the ground. A surprised yelp left her lips. Landing roughly on the floor, she blinked. The rage-filled eye glowing down at her caused her other half to flinch back, but Frost only smirked. Gripping his shoulders, she flipped them over, her fist flying down at his face. Frost was the wild one who charged forward, and Izu was the one who made every day brighter. So then, why did she look so much like her other half? Shifting slightly, Katsuki didn't realize he was backing away until he'd put the two-colored boy in front of him like a shield. The confused expression on Half and Half's face did nothing to make his mood better. He wasn't a coward, but being around his mother had given him a healthy respect for scary females. Izuku felt hollow, like a part of her was gone. Clenching her hands, she knew what was missing, her other half. Barely noting her teacher's eyes widen in shock, she moved without thinking. Aizawa had been teaching a long time. As such, he'd dealt with angry students. The small hand that wrapped around his collar was unexpected, and it made him realize his quirk was still active. Wildfire green eyes glared at him with such hate that he almost forgot she was a child. "Give her back erasure," she hissed. It was hot hate that kept her there, even despite the fear she felt at the moment. All the emotions she hadn't felt since she was 6 came rushing back. Everything that Frost had kept her from feeling. The anger was so much that she felt like she was burning. Pain and hate intertwining so vividly that it took her breath away. Was this what Frost dealt with every day? Her other half had always kept the negative side of their emotions at bay. A dam so that she didn't have to feel it. She said her. A mental quirk then. Most likely something like Tokoyami's. That meant she had 2, and he erased the wrong one. A mistake he would never apologize for. Closing his eyes, Aizawa deactivated his quirk, and was surprised when he felt a foot stomp down on his own. Twitching, he ignored the girl completely as she stalked past him to stand beside her blonde friend. Just this once he would allow that because he was the one to mess up. He would talk to her after class. Pointedly, he hoped that news of this wouldn't reach his lover, as embarrassing as it was to have his foot stomped on by a little girl. He knew it would be worse once his loudmouth boyfriend learned of this. Liquid gold was the color of her eyes, and Katsuki felt more relieved than he ever had, especially since the hollow feeling was gone. Frost may be annoying, but she was still his sister. Crossing her arms, the girl showed disinterest despite the fact he could see lingering fear in her eyes. What he didn't know was that she wasn't afraid of Aizawa, not anymore. She was afraid of what Izu would say now that she knew the truth. She'd been hiding every negative emotion they felt from her other half. All the pain and anger was buried behind a wall that had broken down when she'd been erased for a moment. Although Izu hadn't said anything, she knew it was only a matter of time until her other half brought it up. Frost didn't want Izu to hate her. The testing was over quickly, but Frost never let her other half take back control, and Izu was all too happy to let her take the reins. Staying near Katsuki, Frost ignored almost everyone else. Although she did send small smiles to Kaminari when the boy decided to try and cheer her up. He still reminded her of a puppy, and at that moment she decided that he would become Pack. Once she let Izu tell the others about her, right now she would watch and learn. They would most likely think her eyes were the product of using her quirk. "You all pass, and no one gets expelled," Aizawa announced. He was just done for today. Going home to cuddle with his cats was now his top priority, even if one of them was a blonde human. Frost sighed, her eyes closing in relief, even as her classmates broke into cheers. She was glad they weren't going to be expelled from the class. Feeling Katsuki's hand squeeze her shoulder, she resisted the urge to sigh. "I'm all right," she said, opening her eyes. Nodding, the blonde released her and returned his attention to Kirishima. She really was all right, but Minta wouldn't be if he kept watching her like that. Narrowing her eyes at the boy, she wondered if their teacher would notice a flying grape-haired brat if she kicked him. As if sensing her intentions, the boy paled and moved slightly away from her. Midoriya, stay behind, Aizawa ordered when his class began heading toward the locker rooms. Stiffening, Frost turned slowly, barely holding back a growl when she met his eyes. Unlike before, when she'd looked at him, instead of irritation there was intrigue. Tilting his head, he smirked, saying, "You have two quirks just like Todoroki. I'm taking a guess that one of them is mental. Probably a split personality too, if those eyes are any clue." "Yes," she said, simply ignoring the way Izu tensed. She would not back down. Tilting her head, she stared into his eyes without hesitation. "Work on controlling your strength. If I see another broken arm, I'll expel you from this class," he stated. It was a warning and an apology. Nodding slowly, she walked away from him. It didn't take her long to get changed into her uniform. Cursing the skirt once again, she walked to the gate to wait for Katsuki. All she wanted to do now was go home, curl up, and sleep. Reaching out for Izu, she frowned when she felt the confusion from her other half. They would have to talk about everything tonight. "Popsicle, where's Izu?" Katsuki asked. Stopping beside her, he waited for an answer. When she looked away from him, he growled. He hated being ignored, especially by her. "She's hiding," Frost said. Glancing at him, she noted the worry in his eyes. Scoffing, he began walking. Staying beside him, she didn't bother to try starting a conversation. She wasn't in the mood to start an argument with him. Not when she didn't know if Izu would forgive her or not. "Do you remember the day we met?" Katsuki asked suddenly. Clenching her fist, Frost frowned slightly. Of course, she did. So did her mother. They'd destroyed Izu's room. "Please don't bring that up," she said, a whining tone to her voice. They'd had to clean the entire house after their fight, and her mother had grounded her for a week. "It wasn't that bad," he said. Twitching, she struggled not to punch him. "You threatened me," she said. They both knew she was trying to guilt-trip him. Rolling his eyes, he ruffled her hair. "We threatened each other," he said. When she growled at him, he smirked, saying, "Besides, you hated me." "I hated how you treated Izu," she corrected. Even then, she hadn't hated him. Katsuki was special to her and Izu. He was their best friend, the only person in the world she trusted with her other half. As much as they fought, she would never hate him. Stopping, Katsuki frowned. How he treated Izu? He'd been a bully and a jerk. Izu had been alone and quirkless, but he'd never stepped in to help her. She'd needed him, and he'd left her behind. Hell, he'd helped them hurt her. After all these years, he knew he didn't deserve the trust they placed in him. Izu had never been angry with him, ever. But he would never forgive himself for hurting her. "I never apologized for that, did I?" he asked. Frost froze. If he started talking about feelings, she would punch him. She wasn't good at emotions. Raising his head, Katsuki smiled, saying, "I won't apologize until I've made up for everything." Kaken. Stumbling, Katsuki caught her on instinct. Hugging him tightly, Izuku bit her lip. Hearing Frost's sigh in her mind, she tightened her grip. She never blamed him. They were kids and all children made mistakes. She just wished he'd stop blaming himself. Feeling his hand brush through her hair, she closed her eyes. He could hear her whispering that it was all right, but he couldn't believe her. There was so much that he had to make up for. Frost looked away. Letting Izu take care of Katsuki, she cut herself off from the world outside Izu's mind. Stalking through the dense trees, she paused at the opposite edge to Izuku's domain. She'd tried so hard to never let Izuku feel any pain. When she was first created, Izu had been in so much pain that she was suffering every single day. She'd stopped that and took it all away without her other half knowing. This was what she was supposed to do. She would suffer for years to keep Izu safe, but she'd failed. Izu had felt everything she was hiding from her. The pain, hate, and anger. Kneeling, Frost touched the dark cellar door. It looked so out of place, hidden by the trees and fallen leaves. The silver lock was untouched. Even without her, the defenses on Izu's mind had been held in place. Narrowing her eyes, she stood. That memory would never escape. She would burn the entire world to ashes before she allowed Izuku to see what she'd hidden. It would break her. Turning on her heel, she walked away from the trees behind her, shifting to conceal the door once again. Switching to her wolf form, she laid down slowly, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Watching the leaves drift in the wind, she closed her eyes slowly. She still had a few hours until Izuku arrived. Turning off the light to her room, Izuku looked out the window. Bright stars lit up the sky above her. Today was nice, and she liked her classmates. She could even learn to tolerate Minta, as long as he stayed away from her. Laying down slowly, she closed her eyes. The sensation of falling captured her senses before she was landing in a field of flowers. Standing slowly, she glanced around. She didn't see Frost anywhere. Izuku had always known that Frost was keeping things from her. She'd never entered the forest that served as her other half's domain. But now, standing at its edge, she could feel the pain radiating from it. Taking a step inside, she felt like crying. Frost felt this every day and never complained. How could she feel this and say nothing? Crying out, Izuku stumbled forward. Her heart was being torn apart. Cold hands touched her shoulders, pulling her away from the trees. Gasping, she leaned back, her fingers clenching the fabric of her shirt as she struggled to breathe. Sinking to her knees, she didn't notice the gentle fingers running through her hair or the humming she could hear in her ear. A frown marred Frost's face as she held her other half tightly. Sending a cold glare to the forest, she wasn't surprised when the forest shivered and drew back a little. "What were you thinking?" she asked. It was a question for both Izu and their emotions. The shadows between the trees sank back, leaving the two of them in peace as she nuzzled her face against Izu's neck. "You feel like that every day," Izu whispered. Tensing, Frost shook her head, but didn't disagree. Anything to protect her. She would do anything to keep Izuku from feeling pain. Closing her eyes, Frost whined slowly. She could feel Izu shaking, and knew the girl was crying. Instead of allowing herself to fall apart, Izuku twisted in her other half's arms. Narrowing her burning eyes, she said, "Let me take some of it." "No," Frost stated. The quickness of the word almost gave Izuku whiplash. "Why not?" she asked. Frost had never denied her anything. Her quirk had always given her what she wanted. "I will protect you," she said, her golden eyes closing. Even if Izuku didn't understand why she would do this. "It's my pain too," Izu said. Reaching out, she gripped Frost's arms, a small smile on her face. She shouldn't have to do this alone. Pulling her close, she whispered, "Frost, you don't have to do this alone. You've been protecting me all this time. Let me help. Please, I don't want you to hurt anymore. I can handle it." Returning the hug, Frost said nothing. There were some things that Izu wouldn't be able to handle, and this was one of them. She kept the pain hidden for a reason, and letting Izuku feel even a little bit of it was not something she was willing to allow ever again. Humming softly, Frost ran her fingers through the other girl's hair. She didn't let go until she was sure that Izu was asleep. Keeping her eyes on the trees, she didn't get much sleep that night. Katsuki knew something was wrong between the two when Izu was pouting the next day during class. As a personal rule, she never allowed her emotions to show so blatantly on her face. For her to do so told him that she and Frost were having issues. Letting his lips twitch into a frown, he turned his attention back to the front. After spending an entire day doing ordinary classes, he was glad to know their next class would be practical. Maybe a physical lesson would allow the two to work out some frustration. If he got to fight against Frost, then he'd be happy. Watching the door slam open, and All Might enter with a shout, he rolled his eyes. Knowing about One for All really took the amazement out of the man's entrances. Although in contrast, the knowledge the man was dating his aunt made it a lot more fun to play around with him. Especially since Aunt Inko couldn't scold him during school hours. Picking up her costume case, Izu allowed Frost to take over. It wasn't as if she would be needed for this anyway. Compared to her other half, she was useless during a fight. The thought made her frown. Frost was the one handling the pain she didn't even know about. Why couldn't she do anything to help? Weren't they supposed to help each other? Katsuki smirked when he noted the golden eyes running over their assembled classmates. It seemed like Izu designed her costume with Frost in mind too, if the dark color scheme was anything to go by. She'd always looked good in black. Blinking away the thought, he returned his attention to All Might to see the man analyzing her just as he had been. Picking at the dark green fingerless gloves on her hands, Frost sent Minta a wordless warning when he managed to get too close to her. Paling, likely remembering the last time her eyes were gold, he returned his attention to someone less likely to punt him across a track field. She'd wanted her costume to be loose, but it seemed the design team had decided that clingy was the way to go. At least they'd gotten the weapon right. She would have rather the entire outfit be black, not only the pants and vest. But she supposed Izu had to have some design input. "We are not a stealth hero. All your clothing doesn't have to be black," Izu cut in. The irritation in her voice was easy to hear, and despite herself, Frost felt her hackles rising. She knew the anger in Izu was caused by her and her refusal to allow her other half to take on any of their negative emotions. "Yes, it does," she said, barely holding back her snap. She hated when Izu was mad at her, but she wouldn't apologize for protecting her. No it doesn't, Izu argued. Biting her lip, Frost held back a snarl. Instead of allowing her anger at being challenged to overwhelm her, she stayed calm. Look, you got your green gloves and blue top. You could have at least let me have the boots, she said. She would be the one fighting anyway. Unless Izu suddenly gained an aptitude for martial arts, she would be the one on the battlefield. A wave of pure annoyance washed over her, and she blinked. Was this really affecting Izu that much? Just pay attention. Class is about to start, Izuku snapped. Turning her attention back to their teacher, Frost sighed. She hated fighting with Izu. Bakugo's team are the villains and Midoriya's team are the heroes, All Might announced as all the others turned to look at them. Katsuki and Ida were going to fight against Uraraka and Frost. All Might narrowed his eyes as the two stared each other down. He doubted either of them actually cared about the objective of this training when they could fight each other. They were way too similar to each other to give away a chance to play. Playing with the zipper of her black vest, Frost kept her face blank. It was her against Katsuki, something All Might was currently frowning about. All four of them knew that once the fighting started, there was no way the building would stay in one piece. Tapping her dark green boot-clad feet against the ground, she raised a challenging eyebrow as their classmates backed away from the murderous intent emanating from her blonde packmate. Feeling exasperation from Izu, she tilted her head. This was going to be fun. Uraraka shifted as she watched her partner and opponent smirk at one another. Standing behind the emerald-haired girl, she noticed the golden wings on the back of her black vest. It was the same as her jacket from the entrance exam. It reminded her of the moment this girl saved her and caused her to feel warm. Smiling slightly, she shrugged when Ida sent her a strange look. She didn't think that Midoriya would let her get hurt here, even if her partner was rolling in battle lust. I said start fighting once the exercise started, not before, All Might scolded. Laying a hand on each of their shoulders, he kept them from attacking one another. Pouting, Frost allowed him to push her back toward Uraraka. Watching Katsuki vanish into the training building, she didn't even glance over as All Might led their classmates to the waiting area. So you know Bakugo then? Uraraka asked once they were alone. Frost raised an eyebrow but nodded slowly. During middle school, she hadn't actually interacted with most of their classmates. Feeling slightly uneasy, she bit her lip. It's okay to talk to her, Izu said. She was still mad about Frost's refusal to allow her to help, but she knew that this was a big moment for her other half. Putting aside her anger for Frost was something she could do right now. That did not, however, mean she would be letting this go for good. They would be talking about this later. We've known each other our whole lives. Our parents went to school together, Frost said. Seeing understanding light up the other girl's eyes, she assumed the girl would ignore her now. Instead, Uraraka leaned toward her. Why do your eyes turn gold? She asked. Frost shifted in discomfort, but didn't back away. Quirk side effect, she said. Nodding, the brunette moved back a wide smile on her face. Well, I think it's pretty, she said. Eyes widening, Frost looked away as her face heated up. How did Izu talk to people all day? Falling into silence, the two girls waited for the exercise to start. Frost knew that Katsuki would come for her first, mainly since she'd challenged him earlier. Stealing a glance at the brunette, Frost frowned slightly. The girl would be in her way when she fought. Ignoring the disappointing feeling she got from Izu, Frost turned away again. Hearing the timer to start, both girls entered the building. The dark hallway was way too quiet, and Frost could almost feel the anxiety coming from her partner. She didn't hear Katsuki coming toward her, but she knew he would find her, or that he was already on his way. To ensure that their fight didn't damage the objective, he would send his partner to one of the above floors, where the pseudo-bomb would be safe. All right, Katsuki will be coming for me, so when he does sneak past and search the higher floors, Frost ordered. Seeing Uraraka nod, she led the girl up the steps to the second floor. They'd barely gotten 2 feet in before something rolled toward them. The light pink ball impacted her feet before exploding in a puff of smoke. All she could smell was cotton candy. Eye twitching, she resisted the urge to curse as her advantage was taken away. Hearing Uraraka cough beside her, she gritted her teeth. He would pay for this. She wouldn't be able to get the smell out of her hair for a week. Seeing a flash of yellow, she stiffened. Taking a step toward him, she smirked. Uraraka, Izu screamed. If Katsuki attacked, then the brunette would get hurt. Letting a curse fall from her lips, Frost switched targets. Grabbing the choking brunette by the collar, she activated One for All. Jumping out of the way, she held the other girl tightly as the ground where they'd been standing exploded. Katsuki raised an eyebrow as he waved away the smoke created from both his presumptive attack and his explosion. Frost snarled, kneeling in front of Uraraka as the girl blinked in surprise. It was amusing to him how protective she was acting about her partner. As much as she claimed not to care, it was in her nature to protect those around her. Seeing her reach for the metal weapon attached to her black pants, he lunged. "Go," Frost ordered, snapping Uraraka out of her shock. Sidestepping his punch, she unhooked the rod from her pants before pressing a button. As the staff extended, she used it to knock his hand to the side and redirect his explosion to the wall instead of herself. Hearing Uraraka run off, she sighed in relief. "Should have let the extra take the hit," he said. The coldness of the statement shaking her for a moment as she backed away. In a way, he was right. Letting Uraraka take the attack would have been the perfect distraction to attack him. But she wasn't about to start sacrificing her teammates just to get a hit in. Uraraka had trusted her, and she couldn't let the girl get hurt for it. Narrowing her eyes, she tilted her head back, causing him to smirk. Dancing away from him, she avoided the explosion he sent in her direction before twisting out of his way and slamming her staff into his shoulder. This one was made out of tungsten, meaning his explosions couldn't damage it. To say she'd learned her lesson after he broke 6 of them was an understatement. Left, a jump, then an explosion to put distance, as you predicted. Smirking, Frost lunged as Katsuki took a step to the left. Seeing her actions, he matched her expression. Both of them knew what the other would do, so fighting like this would be more of a chore than anything else. Still, neither of them was willing to give up without a fight. Plus, this was fun, and they didn't have to hold back. That was a lie. Katsuki would always hold back when it came to fighting against Izuku. Even if he knew it was Frost in control of her body, it would be Izuku who got hurt. Gritting his teeth, he stumbled back when her staff impacted his chest. The fire-filled look on her face was enough to make him smirk. Deciding to put aside his fears about hurting her, he lashed out, sending an explosion toward her face. Kaminari winced as he watched the two fight. Reconciling the fact they were supposed to be friends with their viciousness in battle was hard. He was worried for Izuku, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the girl fighting wasn't actually Izuku. The golden eyes, narrowed in such frustration, were nothing like the soft ones he'd seen on her earlier. He would not, however, admit his surprise or suspicions. "They do know this is training, right?" whined to whine. The complaint causing an almost unanimous eye roll. No one wanted to agree with the annoying boy, but they all did on some level. Crossing her arms, Momo frowned slightly. While true it was supposed to be practice, the level these two showed let them know not to underestimate either of them. Not only were they good at battle, but the smiles showed they were enjoying themselves. She already knew that despite her versatile quirk, she wouldn't stand a chance against them at a physical battle. Someone like her was nothing but a burden if caught in a fight like this. Tightening the grip she had on her arms, she frowned slightly. It was all too much for her to think about at this moment. "I doubt they care very much," Tokoyami said. "They're stupid," Dark Shadow commented. Kaminari raised an eyebrow, his instincts trying to tell him something. Frowning, he bit his lip as the windows on the right side of the building exploded. He had to wonder how Tokoyami dealt with having another personality when he had only one body. Wait. Dual personality quirks weren't that common, but they were always shown on the outside somehow. "Two," he whispered, realization sparking in his eyes. "Gold and green, 2 every different eye colors for 2 personalities. Or 2 different people." The anger she held for Aizawa during the quirk assessment test suddenly made sense if he erased her other personality. Knowing this, he had to wonder which one of them had chosen to save him that day, or did they both? No, it didn't really matter. She'd helped him so he would keep her secret until she was ready to tell everyone. All Might clenched his teeth when Frost knocked Katsuki's gauntlet upward. The explosion tearing through the ceiling above them and continuing. He was going to lecture the two about recklessness later. But for now, the heroes' team had won. Announcing it, he moved toward the door. He had 2 little children to scold for their behavior. Not that either of them cared very much to listen to him. They would listen to Inko once he told her how they destroyed almost an entire building. He would enjoy seeing them get in trouble. Frost sighed, reaching up to touch the burned skin of her arm as Katsuki leaned against the wall beside her. She might have won, but they'd almost completely destroyed the building. Something that she knew All Might was going to lecture them for. Wincing at the pain, she frowned slightly. During their battle, he'd pulled his punches. He redirected his attacks on purpose, so he wouldn't hurt Izuku more than necessary. His loyalty to her other half was impressive, especially since she knew that once upon a time he wouldn't have even cared a little bit about her. "You held back," she said. The words sounding childish even to her, but she wanted a fight that would be challenging. When he simply grunted and motioned toward the stairs, she rolled her eyes. He never did like admitting when he held back. Their partners were chatting as they descended, mainly with Ida complimenting Uraraka. Katsuki pushed away from the wall as All Might came into view. Destruction was supposed to be kept to a minimum, he scolded. He knew that neither of them cared, and that showed when Katsuki shrugged before moving toward the exit. Rubbing his forehead, the man sent Frost an annoyed glance. Grinning at him without regret, the girl walked to Uraraka's side. I see you managed to touch the bomb, Frost said. The wide smile that crossed the other girl's face was mildly amusing. It was nice being able to interact with her classmates for once. Although it would be better if they knew it was her instead of Izu. Following All Might back to the viewing area, Frost paled a little when Kaminari slung his arm over her shoulders. Not even the annoying glare Katsuki sent the boy's way caused him to release her. She'd never had her personal space invaded like this, and it felt weird. Not in a bad way, it was almost warm. Kaminari himself felt warm like a heater. Confused, she sent a glance to Katsuki, who tilted his head in her direction before shrugging and turning his attention to their teacher. Well, that was no help at all. Having fun, Izu asked, the teasing tone causing her other half to roll her eyes. They both knew how uncomfortable this made her. Watching the next team enter an undestroyed building, she leaned against Kaminari's side slightly. Not really, you want to be in control, she asked. Being this close to another person who wasn't Katsuki was weird. Very weird, but it didn't feel bad, just strange. Sure, she said. Kaminari knew the instant the girl in his hold changed. Discreetly watching her face, he noticed her eyes change from gold to green. Her face soften, and her body relaxes from its battle-ready stance. Smiling softly, he turned his attention back to the monitor. He mentally congratulated himself for learning the truth before his eyes widened slightly. The entire building and hallway were frozen solid. Izu gasped, her own eyes glued to the screen, as Todoroki walked through the iced-over building like it was completely normal. He was definitely strong, much stronger than she'd thought he was. From the growl, Katsuki let out he was either looking forward to fighting him or just surprised that someone that strong was in their class. She honestly thought it was the former just from how much he loved fighting. He would also love to prove that he was the strongest student in their class. The only thing she could see was the saddened look in his mismatched eyes. Todoroki seemed truly sad at the moment, and she wondered why. It reminded her of the looks she would see in the mirror during middle school. Looking away from him, she watched Katsuki clench his fists. She could almost feel the battle lust oozing off his body. Rolling her eyes, she knew he would have pent-up aggression for the next few hours. Are you still mad at me? Frost asked, the insecurity in her voice drawing Izu's attention. In truth, she hadn't actually been angry in the first place. Annoyed and a little bit sad, but never angry. She would never be angry with Frost. Although she did wish her other half would trust her. I was never mad, Frost, just disappointed, she said. The pang of annoyance she felt coming from Frost was amusing. Now you sound like our mom, Frost complained. The words were enough that she bit her lip to hold back laughter. Getting to the school an hour early meant she would have time to talk to the support team about her hero costume. At least that was her plan. Unfortunately, the literal herd of reporters blocking the gate was ruining it. She now had a healthy hate for reporters. Hearing Katsuki growl beside her, she winced a little. He definitely had no respect for the media. We could always go up, Frost said. Glancing at the top of the gate, and then back at the herd of reporters, Izuku frowned. Didn't Yua have defenses against that sort of thing? Still, she would rather brave the defenses than deal with the media. Maybe Katsuki could distract them. Flickering her eyes to Katsuki, she gave him a small nod at the questioning look. Smirking, he stepped forward, drawing the attention away from her. Giving him a thankful nod, she slipped through the crowd. Waiting beyond the gate, she smiled when Katsuki started cursing the reporters for getting in his way. Amusement shining in her eyes as he shoved forcefully through the crowd. He didn't even hesitate to growl and snarl his way through. She'd always envied his courage, if nothing else. Seeing the amused smile on her face, he rolled his eyes as he stepped into place beside her. What? He asked. The gruff question didn't hide his matching amusement. The media is an important part of being a hero, she said. The scoff that left his lips caused her lips to curl into a smile. That's why you'll hide from them, he said. The statement causing Frost to collapse into a fit of giggles. Pouting, Izuku glared at him. I do not hide, she said. Seeing her expression, he snorted. She reminded him of a puppy when she looked like that. Right. And I'm not a complete bastard, he said. The words catching her off guard for a moment. One of the passing students raised an eyebrow, but scurried away when he growled in their direction. You're not? She asked. The mock-surprised expression she gave him was completely teasing, and he knew it. Rolling his eyes, he smirked at her. Not to the people I care about, he admitted just loud enough she could hear him. the words causing her lips to tilt into a bright smile. True, so Kirishima huh? She teased quietly. Freezing for a moment, ignoring the way his face heated up, he scowled at her. Don't you have somewhere to be? He snapped. Grinning, she nodded and headed for the support team. Shaking his head, Katsuki entered their classroom. Meeting the twin-colored eyes of Todoroki, he suppressed the urge to shout for the other boy to fight him. He wanted to know which of them was stronger, and he hated the disinterested stare on the boy's face. Izuku had never been very social, so making friends wasn't something she was good at. As such, she couldn't see the malicious intent in Monoma's eyes when he waved to her from the door to Class 1B. The cold glow in his eyes was hidden from her as he stepped into the hallway. She was his only link to Class 1A, and he wasn't about to let her get away. The knowing glance Kendo sent at his back was nothing that he didn't expect. She didn't trust that his attention toward the green-haired girl was honorable. In truth, it wasn't. He would enter her circle of friends, and she, in turn, would tell him everything about Class 1A. Then at the sports festival, he would show her just what trusting him cost. The thought made it hard to hide the wicked smirk threatening to show on his face. He should have been in the best class. He would make their lives hell for taking his spot away. Everyone in Class 1A had to pay for getting in his way. Midoriya, thanks for the offer of help the other day, he said, sending a charming smile toward the girl. When her face turned a lovely shade of red, he knew his plan was working. She looked away from him shyly, and Monoma could have sworn he felt shivers go down his spine. Peeking over his shoulder, he stiffened at the glare on Kendo's face. It was full of malicious intent. Quickly turning around, he made a mental note not to go near his classmate for a while. It was no issue, she said. Reaching up to play with her hair, she heard Frost growl. Still, it was a lovely thing to do, and I feel indebted to you. Right up until I stab you in the back, he said. The unspoken second half was running through his mind as he watched her fidget nervously. How was someone so naive supposed to become a hero? It made his blood boil that she got into the elite class while he was stuck with the leftovers. Izu will be late, Frost said. She didn't like him or trust him. Something about him reminded her of their father, and she wasn't about to let her other half be tricked by this boy who smelled like a rat. Keeping the thoughts to herself, she watched as Izu politely excused herself. When he showed his true colors, she would deal with him herself. Heading to support team building, Izuku didn't give herself time to think over her other half's hostile tone. There were just some people that Frost didn't like, and it looked like Monoma was one of them. Usually, she was right about people, but Izuku wanted to give them chances to prove her wrong. Knowing that Frost didn't like him, however, made her uncomfortable. She hated being in the crossfire when Frost decided to act up. Entering the building, she blinked when she was assaulted by a blur of pink. The sound of Frost growling was the only thing she could hear as she was literally dragged into a classroom. Opening her eyes, she tilted her head as the pink-haired kidnapper introduced herself. Meeting Hatsume was one of the strangest experiences in her life. The pink-haired girl was energetic, almost too much so. The girl reminded her of a puppy, and Izuku was oddly amused by the way her face lit up. Still, every time the other girl came near her, Izuku was tempted to run away. It didn't help that the second she was able to, May started raining down questions so quickly that Izuku couldn't really keep up. Feeling slightly dizzy, she pouted as Frost began laughing at her. Knowing that the eager girl wasn't a threat was enough for the wolf as she settled in to watch Izu get verbally assaulted by the girl. It was entertaining to watch her other half become so flustered. Katsuki. Sitting in the classroom, he immediately wanted to leave by jumping out the window. It wasn't Kaminari flirting with earphone girl or the grape-haired runt mouthing off and trying to peek under Momo's skirt. It was the bright red eyes currently shinning 2 feet to his left. Kirishima smiled and his heart melted just a bit. Katsuki Bakugo had a crush, and it was driving him insane. The urge to slam his head onto his desk until the feeling vanished was almost overwhelming. He wasn't supposed to have a crush on the cute redhead. He was supposed to beat boys away from his little sister or laugh, while Frost did it for him. Deciding that he would just ignore it, he turned his head away and tried to ignore the entire world. 20 minutes remained until class started, and he could forget the feeling for that long. All he had to do was keep his distance, and he would be fine. Smelling raspberries, he froze when Kirishima brushed past him to talk to Tape Boy. Cursing, he shifted slightly, his eyes trained on the boy's back. He smelled like raspberries. What the hell was he supposed to do when the boy he kind of liked smelled like his favorite fruit? Cursing internally, he resisted the urge to scream as Kirishima smiled. He was as bad as Mineta. Laying his head down on the table, he tried to think of anything other than how much he liked the red color of Kirishima's eyes. He'd never noticed someone's eye color before now, especially since most people were useless. Lemons were literally his most hated fruit, and it still didn't take his mind off the male standing a few feet away. Kirishima tensed, feeling intense eyes on his back. Glancing behind him, he paled a little at the expression on Katsuki's face and tried to think of anything he'd done in the last 2 days to result in such a glare. Coming up with nothing, he shifted nervously and tried to continue his conversation with Zero. Ferrets, vile rat-like creatures. Yet looking at the way Kirishima's hair just barely touched the back of his neck, he could forget all about them. His mom's cooking that he almost choked to death on 2 days ago. Honestly, the woman was a terrible cook. It was why he cooked his own meals when he wasn't over at Aunt Inko's house. Knowing that it wouldn't work when the other boy sent him a hesitant smile, he almost felt his soul leave his body. Frost being Frost, jolting a little, he resumed his position of laying across his desk like a lifeless starfish. Why couldn't he just ignore the redhead and pretend he didn't exist as he did for almost everyone else? The smile. It was the smile that reminded him of Izu's when he left her at the age of 4 to go hang out with the cool kids. And the one Frost gave him after she beat him half to death the first time they met. All of them meant acceptance. Biting his lip, he resisted the urge to laugh. The first person to find out his sexuality was a hyperactive mutt with anger issues. Feeling someone slide into the seat beside him, he raised his head. Speak of the devil, and she shall appear. The traumatized look on Izuku's face was only outclassed by the golden eyes shining back at him. Horror and regret were the only emotions he could see. So. One word and I stab you, she hissed just loud enough he could hear her. The dam holding back his laughter broke. Pouting as he laughed at her, Frost rolled her eyes. Never again would she go near May. Well, at least not for another few weeks. She still wanted those knife sheaths on her boots, and maybe the girl wouldn't be around when she tried again. Hearing Izu whine, she winced a little. May's ranting had been amusing at first. Then it turned completely personal and invasive. Did you at least ask about getting knife sheaths on your boots? He asked once he calmed down. Hearing her head impact the desk as mumbled cursed left her mouth, he chuckled. Glancing up, he made the mistake of meeting Kirishima's curious red eyes, and his heart rate skyrocketed. Feeling his lips curve into a smirk, he only turned away when her elbow slammed into his side. Flinching, he sent her a glare as she stuck out her tongue to mock him. Hearing Aizawa enter the room, she tensed when his gaze landed on her. Curiosity and idle amusement glittered in his eyes. She didn't want to be the focus of his attention, especially not when she didn't have any sharp objects around. While Izu was both slightly frightened and angry at him, Frost felt something very different. Heart-stopping terror. He'd erased her and left Izu at the mercy of their mind and memories, something that both she and Inko thought should stay buried. Unlike her, Izu was pure and innocent. She didn't remember the way his hands had wrapped around their neck, or how much it hurt to be slammed against the wall. And if Frost had her way, the girl never would. The darkness resting in their mind would never touch her. It was something she'd promised herself the first time they'd met. She would protect Izu from everything, including their own blood. Holding Aizawa's gaze, she dared him to say anything about the fact her eyes were gold, or that she was slightly more feral than her other half. Today, we will be doing something very important, he said as he moved toward the board at the front of the class. Holding back a shiver once his gaze left her, she reached out to Izu only to find her half asleep. Come on, Izu. Please don't make me hang out with your classmates, she said. The complaint sounded more childish than she'd meant it to. She didn't want to be around Minta today, or Ida for that matter. Logically, she knew he hadn't meant to scare Izu, but emotionally she wanted to beat him into the dirt. Go away, Izu mumbled. Curling up in the flowers, she tried to hide away from her other half, and the trees that suddenly seemed haunting. Izu, Frost hissed. The warning tone was enough to make Izu open her eyes and sit up. Blinking away the sleep, she pouted. I'm tired, and maybe this way you'll find a mate or something like you wanted, she said. Frost blinked at the sarcastic tone before wincing a little. Izu sounded mad. Had she done something to offend her? The insecurity she'd been harboring since their minor disagreement came back to the surface like a spear running through her heart. Are you still mad at me? She asked. The soft vulnerability in the question caused Izu to freeze. Flinching slightly, she frowned and thought over her words. She had sounded angry. Sighing slightly, she considered what to say before the nightmare from last night came rushing back, and she decided to go with the truth. No, I'm just tired. Last night was horrible and Kakin wasn't there to chase away the nightmares, she said. The phantom feeling of sludge brushing against her skin caused her to shiver, and she curled up more as the flowers around her turned a sickening black. Frost snarled the sound, driving their demons back into the cages. She locked them in. Running her hand through Izu's hair, she frowned. Why was she so weak that she couldn't protect her? Protecting Izu was the entire reason she existed. It was the living slime again, wasn't it? She asked. That one moment had been her greatest failure. She was the strong one. Letting this happen made her nothing but a failure. How was she supposed to protect her if she was trapped in here when disaster decided to strike? No, materialization was the only answer, and she wouldn't let it slip through her fingers. Sorry, Izu whispered. She could feel the anger simmering in her other half and felt responsible. Stifling her anger, Frost sighed. Don't ever apologize to me. It's not your fault, she said. The assurance doing nothing to help Izu. The guilt in her heart was eating her alive. She wanted to help Frost and Kaken. He'd had it worse than her that day. The villain had held him longer than it had her. Burying her face in her hands, she whimpered. Why did she always have to be so useless? Frost frowned at the self-resentment she could feel from her other half. They could talk to Toshi about the nightmares. As a pro, he had to have some of his own, yet talking to a man they admired about something that hurt them so deeply was a horrifying thought. That left either their mom, who to be honest wouldn't know how to help, or Katsuki. He would help. Despite everything, he was still their best friend and brother. He wouldn't allow Izu to suffer through these alone if he could help her. He gets them too, Frost said softly. The words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. Katsuki's nightmares were an unspoken taboo amongst the three of them. She knew he hated being weak, and they made him just that. Pulling her hands away from her face, Izu glanced up at her other half. The fierce expression Frost wore for the world was gone, leaving behind what she was to Izu, and those she loved. A scared, lonely girl trying her best to be strong. The nightmares? Izu asked without actually needing to. She'd helped him through enough nightmares to know that he had one almost every night. She couldn't talk to him about that. He didn't need to be reminded of his weakness. Yeah, his are probably worse though, Frost said. Seeing the guarded expression flicker across Izu's face, she knew she'd overstepped. Drawing the girl into a hug, she stood slowly saying, You could try talking to him about it. Maybe, Izu said. She would at least think about it. Giving her other half a weak smile, Frost nodded and let her consciousness flow toward the world outside their mindscape. Get some sleep, I'll deal with school, she said. Seeing her eyes flicker open, Katsuki tilted his head. It was only when he saw the gold he understood. For some reason, Izu didn't want to come out and Frost wouldn't force her. Sitting up straight as Kaminari passed out paper slips, she turned her questioning eyes to Katsuki. Quickly explaining what was happening, he blinked as a wicked gleam entered her golden eyes. Looking down at the paper in her hand, Frost wrote down the one name she knew everyone would balk at. Katsuki's. Putting it in the hat Yaoyorozu had provided, she let an innocent smile grace her face that Katsuki saw through immediately. Watching her closely, he felt minutely amused as Kaminari broke her act in less than 10 seconds by draping his arm over her shoulder. Holding back a snarl, she sent him a warning look over her shoulder. One that he ignored completely. So how's it going? He asked. The gold told him that the aggressive half was in control, so he made sure to bare his neck. Recognizing the action for what it was, she didn't know whether to be amused or slightly insulted. On one hand, he could clearly tell that she was different than usual, but on the other he was warm. A heated pillow for her to lay on. Katsuki didn't let her cuddle nearly enough. But was that really a good enough reason to let Kaminari touch her? Sending a quick glance to Katsuki, she noticed the amusement in his gaze. Deciding to ignore it, she frowned slightly. What do you want, Kami? Denki, he corrected. Seeing the glare she threw at him, he smiled softly, saying, The girl who saved me gets to call me Denki. For once he wasn't trying to flirt. Not because of the blonde glaring at him either. He was honestly grateful that she helped him. For a moment, it seemed she would toss him across the room and let Bakugo have what was left of him before she sighed. Leaning against him, she turned her attention to Katsuki. Zappy stays, she said. Kaminari gaped as Katsuki began laughing. He didn't know if he should be glad for the nickname. When she looked up at him, he could see the test in her eyes. Would he stay or leave? Accept or challenge? Smirking, he ruffled her hair, causing her eyes to widen. The shock in her golden gaze was enough to make him join Katsuki in laughter. She hadn't expected him to want to be around her after she gave him the nickname. Winner, Katsuki Bakugo with 3 votes, Yaoyorozu announced, drawing their attention. For a tense moment, no one moved. The shocked look on Katsuki's face was enough that he didn't think about very much until he caught Frost's gaze. Her entire form radiated smugness. He rolled his eyes. She wanted to play with their classmates. Shrugging, he stood and decided to ignore the eyes on him as he walked to stand beside the raven-haired girl, who offered him a small smile. Scoffing, he turned his attention to the class. He wouldn't be a pawn in her game, not when there was nothing in it for him. Shifting his gaze over his classmates, he zeroed in on Ida, who was actually about to cry since he wasn't chosen. The boy was responsible enough to be the class representative, and it would annoy Frost. "No thanks. The idiot with the robot legs can have it," he said. Stalking past the shocked Yaoyorozu, he sank back down into his seat and crossed his arms, but not before he gave Frost a knowing smirk. Her pouting expression didn't fade even as Ida rushed to the front and began giving a speech about how happy he was to take the position. Annoyed that her plan for entertainment didn't work, she leaned against Kaminari's side. He wasn't mate material, she knew that. After all, whether he knew it or not, he'd already submitted to her, and she would only choose someone who was strong enough to protect Izu. Despite his cuddly qualities, Kaminari was no protector. He was a jester though, and she would love having him in her court. Plus, anyone who could serve as a pillow was welcome. Feeling her eyes get heavy, she sighed. Closing her eyes, she barely paid attention to Ida's speech. It wasn't that important anyway. She didn't realize she was dozing until she felt Kaminari run his fingers through her hair. Hearing her let out a soft growl that sounded like a purr, Katsuki chuckled, wondering if she even knew what she was doing. Cooing, Uraraka leaned back in her chair to get a closer look, a wide smile appearing on her face. Despite her current position, Frost could still feel those around her. It was the reason she was able to catch Minta's wrist before he could touch the hem of her skirt. Opening one eye slowly, she glanced down at him with enough hate to make him whimper. Tightening her grip, she considered breaking every bone in his arm to teach him a lesson. Sure, Izu wouldn't approve, but Katsuki would. "Midoriya, release Minta and stay. The rest of you are dismissed for lunch," Aizawa said. Meeting the man's eyes, she considered his order. It was the gentle fingers brushing against her own that stopped her from going through with her plan. Glancing at Uraraka, she faltered at the pleading gaze directed at her from the other girl. Releasing Minta slowly, she huffed at her, moved away from her. Too bad he couldn't stay on his side of the room and leave her alone. Feeling Kaminari ruffle her hair one last time, she pouted as her classmates filed out of the room, leaving her alone with their teacher. Sending a pulse out in their mindscape, she felt relieved when she realized Izu was still asleep. Standing, she walked until she was only 2 feet away from him, the distrust in her eyes gaining his attention. Kaminari. Honestly, when he met Midoriya, he hadn't been thinking of anything but making it out alive. After all, as a US student, he couldn't use his quirk to electrocute the thugs mugging him. It was a little unfair. Now, however, he could tell the difference between the Midoriya with green eyes and the one with gold. It was a little strange that he noticed first, given the fact Yaoyorozu was much smarter than him and Todoroki was more observant. But he was willing to bet that they didn't notice because they didn't care. Not in the "they would let her get hurt" way, but in the "they don't know what to look for" way. So when Bakugo pinned him with a glare and motioned for him to sit down at the table he was occupying, he didn't know what to do. He did realize that the blonde and Midoriya were a package deal since they were almost inseparable. Knowing that, he sat down slowly and wasn't very surprised when Uraraka sent him a worried look. Giving her a reassuring smile, he paled when Bakugo growled just loud enough for him to hear it. Briefly, he considered looking for Kirishima, since the redhead could literally calm the devil that was his classmate, but decided not to when Bakugo rolled his eyes. "You do realize she just adopted you, right?" he asked. The tone of the question took his attention away from the actual words, so it took a moment for Kaminari to realize what he said. The confusion caused him to frown. "I don't can. Frost, which is her name, since you haven't asked even after figuring it out, has just made you an unofficial member of our pack." Katsuki started cutting him off. He wasn't an idiot, and he had noticed the way Kaminari could tell the difference between his two sisters. It wasn't very hard to do once someone figured out the real reason her eyes changed colors. Frost, however, wouldn't care enough about the specifics to tell Kaminari how it worked, and Izu was out of commission at the moment, so it fell to him. It was irritating to be the one cleaning up messes for a change. Watching the lightning bug mouth her name for a moment, he rolled his eyes again. "Pack?" Kaminari asked once he was done memorizing her name. Crossing his arms on the table, he leaned forward to hear about his favorite person. "She made you family dumbast. Now rules. 1. Mandatory dinners are every other Friday. I'll text you the address. 2. You're our responsibility. If you need help, don't be a dick about it. 3. Never hurt Izuku. If you do, I'll kill you. Any questions?" Katsuki explained, trying to be polite. Alright, polite was a bit strong, but at least he hadn't cursed every other word. The stunned and slightly terrified look on the other boy's face did make him a little happier though. Seeing red, he looked up and paled as Kirishima sat down beside Kaminari. Blinking, Katsuki growled before escaping the table to enter the lunch line. But not before he sent the redhead a taunting smirk that got a vibrant smile in return. "Frost. Your dual quirk is interesting, Aizawa admitted, his eyes meeting her own. The man's red eyes glowing with interest. Twitching frost narrowed her eyes at him for a moment. She was still angry about him erasing her. Studying her, he smirked, asking, "Which one is in control right now?" "No, don't answer. I think I've figured it out. Midoriya has green eyes and you have gold. You're the offensive one, but what does she amount to other than a pretty little skin suit?" He saw the moment she snapped since he was pushing her toward it. Stepping back, he dodged the kick she sent at his chest. Rage made her eyes liquid gold as she lunged at him like a wild animal. There was none of the refinement she'd had during her battle with Katsuki. Catching her wrist, he made no move to erase her, even as she snarled at him like an animal. Even if she was a wild beast, she was his student, and he would not hurt her. Frost wanted to cut him to pieces until he begged her to stop. She wasn't the heroic one. She didn't care about saving people unless they were pack. This man was nothing to her, but standing here in his hold, she wanted to kill him for the threat he posed to Izu. The memories were held back for a reason, and if he erased her again, she didn't know if her bindings would hold. He would take her away from Izu. He was her greatest fear. "I won't do it," he said softly. The steadily growing fear in her eyes made him feel slightly guilty. Freezing in his hold, she stared at him for a long moment until she nodded. Releasing her, he stepped back, giving her room to breathe. "Everyone hurts her. I won't let you tear her away from me," she warned. Her liquid gold eyes never leaving his. "You're stifling her by fighting her battles," he said. The tone was one of a person who believed they were right. "I'm protecting it more than anyone has ever done besides our mom," she snapped, but did not move to attack him. Katsuki was pack, but he didn't know what that man did. He was her brother, but she would never burden him with their demons. "And if you vanish," he asked, "would Izuku be able to fight without her?" Seeing her about to snarl, he sighed, saying, "If you're the sword, Midoriya should become the shield. Offense and defense are needed to become a hero." "Sword and shield?" she asked. Her aggression was fading slightly, but not enough that he felt he could let his guard down. "Which of you saved Uraraka in training?" he asked. From the way her eyes lit up in realization, he knew the point was made. Nodding, he turned to his desk. The silent dismissal was clear enough that she understood very well. Instead of leaving, she frowned. "My name is Frost," she said. Glancing at her, he noticed that her eyes had settled before an alarm rang out in the building. Cursing, he grabbed her shoulder, pushing her behind him as the door to the classroom opened with a bang. "Aizawa, it's horrible. Smelly reporters have broken onto campus," Mike shouted with the subtlety of a freight train. Frost, for all her emotional control, couldn't stop herself from collapsing into laughter at the annoyed expression on Aizawa's face. Holding her sides tightly, she ignored the glare he sent in her direction. Katsuki groaned, the sound causing Izuku to snicker as he contemplated slamming his head against the seat of the bus. Why did he make Ida the class rep again? Considering how the boy was now screaming for Aoyama to sit down despite the fact he was standing was not a vote in his favor. Katsuki was torn between tossing him out the window while they were moving and simply attacking him. Glancing at Izu, he smirked when he saw her giggling. He still hadn't told her about Kaminari knowing about Frost, something he would do eventually, although letting her find out on her own would be funny. He could imagine how upset she would be that her secret was discovered by what amounted to a Pikachu. "Your quick is a lot like All Might's, isn't it?" Asui asked, gaining Izuku's attention. For a second, she almost panicked before shrugging slowly. Hearing Asui address Izuku, Kaminari frowned his eyes, taking in the way she hunched in on herself. He didn't like it at all. "Your quirk isn't very flashy," Kaminari said, taking the attention away from her. Winking in Asui's direction, he said, "Not that frogs aren't cute. Anything is better than what I have," Kirishima stated, his tone bordering on pouting. He already knew that when it came to flashy quirks, he wasn't even in the running. Compared to Katsuki, or even Aoyama, he wasn't even in the same league. No one would notice him if he was standing beside them. "Not true," Izu said, her voice cutting through the thoughts plaguing him. Meeting the boy's red eyes, she smiled, saying, "Something like your quirk is amazing. It can help so many people." Watching her assure their classmate, Katsuki smirked. Kirishima's quirk would help him as a hero. As his classmates dissolved into laughter and bickering, he turned his attention to the window. Today they were supposed to be training at an off-site facility. Something that he did not like the sound of, especially since All Might was seen on the news this morning. He doubted Toshi would have enough energy to keep up his persona during the training. Hearing Kaminari verbally attack him, he growled and allowed himself to be dragged into the conversation. The annoyance on his face setting off Frost, who began laughing so loudly she was giving Izuku a headache. Leaning back, Izu watched Katsuki snap at the others. It was nice that he was actually having fun for once. While she could tell he didn't really care for some of their classmates, he did seem to like them enough to joke around with them. Not that some of them could tell he was joking. Todoroki tilted his head in confusion as his classmates bickered. He didn't really understand how they were having fun when this was supposed to be a school. Weren't they concerned with how their teacher would see them? Aizawa was literally only a few feet away, and they were acting like children. Frowning, he looked away and locked his eyes on the girl sitting beside Bakigu. There was something strange between her and the boy. Their closeness wasn't something he'd ever seen before. It wasn't romantic. He'd known that the moment the boy didn't attack Kaminari for getting close to her. He supposed he and his siblings could have had that if not for his father, and he couldn't hide the jealousy he felt. Feeling the bus roll to a stop, he stood with the others and frowned slightly when someone was shoved into him. Frost held back a growl. She's been glaring at Kaminari before the boy had decided to distract her by shoving Shiro, who accidentally shoved her. Catching the girl, he stilled when darkened golden eyes flashed up at him. Weren't her eyes green? Letting her go, he looked down at his hands in mild confusion as she exited the bus slowly. Catching sight of Kaminari hiding behind Uraraka, Frost huffed before deciding to let it go. Izuku winced as she regained control. Why did Kaminari insist on annoying Frost? She knew that he had no idea what he was truly doing, but somehow, he managed to push every button to annoy her other half. Stepping into place beside Uraraka, she smiled as the girl fawned over 13. While Izu also thought the hero's Quirk was amazing, she had learned her lesson about drawing attention. She also didn't want to accidentally admit to having at least 4 different ways to kill the pro hero. Hearing Frost snicker, she bit her lip. Most heroes didn't appreciate her habit of analyzing them for weaknesses, although Katsuki loved it. He thought it was hilarious, even if she's created ways to neutralize his quick too. Seeing Aizawa step aside to talk to the rescue hero, she frowned. Wasn't All Might supposed to be here? I bet he used up his time, Frost said. The amusement in her tone causing Izuku's lips to tilt into a smirk. Toshi did have a bad habit of forgetting to check his watch. He'd used up his time while training before and pouted for an hour afterward. Uraraka tapped Izuku on the shoulder and smiled when the girl jolted. It was fun to startle the girl, especially when she zoned out. Sighing, Izuku allowed herself to be drawn into a conversation as 13 returned. Paying only half attention to the hero, she stiffened when a portal appeared. Hearing Frost snarl, she reached back, her fingers closing around the metal rod she used as a weapon. Frost knew the moment the black portal appeared that it wasn't a good thing. In fact, the slew of curses she let flow from her mouth was enough to make Izuku both blush and pale at the same time. Gritting her teeth, she snarled as her golden eyes marred Izu's face. Hearing her classmates exclaim about villains, she scoffed. Of course, the people coming through the spooky black portal weren't villains. They were pastry chefs coming to make little cakes out of their internal organs. This is no time to be sarcastic, Izu snapped. The panic flowing over their connection was rampant. At least I didn't say it out loud, Frost teased, her eyes scanning the assembled villains with irritation. She could feel the tension rising in her classmates, and even Katsuki seemed to be afraid. Taking a step back, she pushed Uraraka further behind her. While she had no doubt the girl could fight, she wasn't about to take chances with prospective pack members. You are literally not helping at all, Izu said. Her panic was bleeding through their connection and making it hard to focus. Taking a deep breath, Frost glanced at Katsuki, who was sticking close to Kirishima. The excitement on his face didn't mask the fear. What, you want me to punch Mr. Hand Fetish in the face for you? She asked, turning her attention to the blue-haired man with a hand attached to his face. Frost waited for her other half to process the statement. Izuku paused. She had a feeling that the man had made very bad choices in life, especially his outfit design. Deciding to ignore it, she sighed. Don't get snappy with me. Unless you've failed to notice, we're both in this situation, she said. When Aizawa lunged forward, Izuku felt a rampant bout of fear. He was a stealth hero, there was no way he could beat all of them. Aizawa can handle it, Frost said. She was trying to reassure both of them. From the almost heartbreaking shriek Izuku let out, it wasn't working. He's a stealth hero, Izu shouted. You are not helping, Frost hissed. Smelling something bitter, she twisted, shoving Uraraka behind her as she locked eyes on the smoke-like villain standing. Or was he floating behind them? His smoke matched the portal. Hearing Izu whisper something about him being the warp gate, Frost glanced at Katsuki. He wouldn't stand by if he saw a chance to attack. When he lunged, it wasn't just him rushing toward the villain. Kirishima went with him. Stiffening, Frost barely managed to take a step forward before the world beneath her vanished. Eyes bleeding green, she lost her hold and Izuku was the one that crashed into the water. Her entire body felt heavy as she struggled to find her way to the surface. Seeing a man with shark-like qualities coming toward her, she sped up. If it hadn't been for Isui appearing, Izuku knew that she most likely wouldn't have made it out of the water. Making a mental note to have Toshi teach them how to fight underwater, she tried to ignore Minta's leering. Her staff wouldn't work in the water, and in battle, Frost wouldn't be able to stay in control for long. The amount of time she had was dependent on the amount of energy she spent. Standing slowly, she reached out and gripped the railing. They were surrounded. "We're separated from the others," Frost said, her tone bordering on annoyed. She would rather be with someone she could work with. But fate put her with Minta, the most useless person in their class. "There's still Isui," Izu said softly. There was something odd about how they'd been separated. Frowning, she gripped the rail harder, whispering, "Why did they put us here?" "Isui's quirk is frog," Frost said. "Why would they put a person with a water-based animal quirk near water?" It didn't make much sense if they were hoping to separate them into places where they would be weak. It would make more sense to send her to the burning city or any place without water. "And they put her near the water," Izuku said. Eyes widening, she shot a glance back down toward the villains, a dark smirk crossing Frost's face. Both knew the answer, but Izu was the one who whispered, "They don't know our quirks. We can tear them apart," Frost said. The growl in her tone causing a feral smirk to rise on Izuku's face. They weren't good at much, but right now they could fight and survive. "Isui, how far can you jump?" she asked. Seeing the other girl's confusion, she started explaining her plan. Katsuki. He could honestly say once he stopped thinking about the fact these people were out to kill him, it was fun to beat them into the ground. They were so slow he could beat them without really trying. It was strange fighting alongside Kirishima, but he found himself not really minding. The other boy could look after himself, so holding his hand wasn't something he had to do. In any other situation, he would have loved to though. Somehow life and death situations didn't seem like the time to confess his feelings. Frowning, Katsuki kicked the legs out from under the villain in front of him before blasting the man to make sure he stayed down. Glancing at Kirishima, he watched the other boy fight off his own adversary. He could sense another villain somewhere, but couldn't pinpoint it. They must have been invisible. Instead of thinking about it, he growled. "I'm going after that warp gate villain," he said tightly. If he knew Frost, she would push Izu back toward the others. That meant she would be going toward the warp gate, or if she was really annoyed, she might go after the villain himself. "Shouldn't we try to find the others?" Kirishima asked. Feeling the villain move closer, Katsuki tensed. The motion too subtle for the other boy to notice. "No. Taking out their escape route is more important," he said. The confused tilt of the other boy's head was making him look like a puppy. Frowning, Katsuki shifted onto his dominant side before saying, "It's not like the others are weak little shits who need their hands held." "So, you're saying that you believe in our classmates?" Kirishima asked. The sly grin that crossed his face fell when Katsuki twisted to the right. Evading the sneak attack, he slammed the center of his palm onto the man's back and activated his quirk. The wicked smirk that lit up his face caused Kirishima to take a step back. Straightening, Katsuki sent the other boy an amused glance before starting toward the door. Silence is pretty much an admission, so he didn't see a reason to verbally answer. Hearing Kirishima start walking behind him, he frowned. The dense feeling of dread he was suddenly experiencing wasn't his. He knew that it belonged to his sister. Quickening his steps, he sneered. "Izuku." Swimming was becoming a priority once they got out of this. Her arms felt like lead as she pulled herself out of the water near the main plaza. The sounds of battle masking her actions as she panted. After escaping the water-based villains, they'd made their way here hoping to gain an understanding of the situation. Kneeling, she offered her hand to Isui before pulling the other girl out of the water slowly. Her eyes shifted to the form of her teacher fighting against the white-haired villain, and she heard Frost growl. She could feel her other half's anxiety from simply being this close to the man. Her eyes landing on Aizawa's crumbling elbow caused her to wince. What should she do? A black mass of muscle appeared behind their teacher, and Frost snarled. The sound filled with more fear than anything else. Something about the thing set off every flight instinct she had. Reaching out, Izuku grabbed Minta from the water and pushed him behind her. This was bad. Glancing at Isui, she maneuvered Minta closer to the other girl. It was a sickening crack that pulled her attention away from Isui and Minta to the image of her teacher laying in a puddle of blood. Stilling, Izuku couldn't stop herself from shaking as Frost whimpered. The sound wasn't something she'd ever heard from her other half before, and she found herself never wanting to hear it again. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt sick as the thing slammed Aizawa's head into the ground, creating a small crater. Izuku felt herself shaking as the blue-haired villain turned to talk to the warp gate, who appeared beside him. Her eyes never left the body of her teacher, even as they mentioned All Might. Part of her was screaming for her teacher. She wanted Toshi to come and save them. Anyone to come and save them. Izu, we need to go now. He was bleeding out on the ground for them. Aizawa was going to die for them, and she was doing nothing. Useless. She was useless. Feeling Asui's hand wrap around her arm, she was stiff as the other girl tried to drag her away. Always protected by everyone, but never the one they relied on. Even Katsuki thought she was useless in a fight. Izu. It had never bothered her to be second best. Frost was stronger and faster. She was just better at everything. So, long as her pack was safe, she never cared about being useless little Izu. Feeling her fingers slide over metal, she realized she was holding her weapon. Frost wanted to run away. Her instincts were screaming to do the same. She knew without a doubt that beating that thing wasn't something she could do. Yet, Aizawa was bleeding out on the ground, and she was doing nothing. It made her sick. Don't. It made her angry. Rage burning through her blood, and causing her green eyes to narrow as the blue-haired villain turned in her direction. His crazed red eyes meeting hers for only an instant before he moved. Instinct had her reaching out her hand, grabbing Asui's, and throwing the girl a few feet to the left before she ducked to avoid his hand. Rolling away, she reached out her hand, barely grazing Mainta's leg. He slipped through her fingers. Dread clamped down on her body so quickly that she couldn't breathe as Mainta screamed, the sound joining with the villain's cackle to create a symphony that turned her blood to ice. Anguish glowed in Mainta's eyes as his neck disintegrated and his head fell to the ground with a dull thud. Her green eyes were wide and filled with tears as she stared at Mainta's head without really seeing him. It was her fault he was dead. If she'd been faster or stronger, he would still be alive. She could hear Frost and Asui screaming her name, but didn't care. All of this was her fault. Feeling the world come back into focus, she stiffened as the villain's hand reached for her neck. She wouldn't be able to move in time. She was going to die. Shaking, shivering, her small body pressed against the wall as her father screamed in her face. Tears leaking from her mother's eyes as the woman desperately tried to pull him away. Frost snarling like a wild animal as she lashed out her nails, creating long bloody lines down his face. No. The metal of her staff unfolded as she moved, the end opening seamlessly to reveal a sharpened spearhead that she swung upward. Cutting through muscle and bone, the weapon felt like a feather in her hand. Blood splattered to the ground. Twirling the spear in her hand, Izuku watched with indifferent eyes as the creature screeched. Tilting her head, she shook the blood off her weapon. It should have been the villain's severed arm on the ground. Pawing the area where its arm had been, the thing glared at her with hate, even as its arm regenerated. Shigaraki raised an eyebrow before motioning for Kurogiri to stand down. He wanted to see what this girl could do. Besides, it had been a while since someone had genuinely tried to kill him. Allowing her lips to tilt up into a cold smirk, Izuku moved. One for all surging through her body as she appeared behind it, the sharpened spearhead aiming for the villain's neck. Killing him was the only thing that mattered. She wouldn't allow him to hurt anyone else. Twisting, Izuku dodged the black hand that would have broken her neck. Dropping to her knees, she lashed out the blade of her weapon, slicing through the creature's legs like butter. Stabbing her blade into the ground, she used it to balance herself before kicking the thing away. Tamura Shigaraki stumbled back, his red eyes widening as the small girl snarled at him. Bloodlust oozing off her, reminding him of a rampaging wolf. The swirling mix of gold and green in her eyes was unsettling as she lunged at him. Leaning back, he avoided the spear before kicking at her chest. Grabbing his leg, she matched his attack, her foot heading toward his face. His hand grazed her boot before she was gone, her entire body jolting to the side as his Nomu grabbed her wrist and tossed her. Twisting in midair, she stabbed her spear into the ground before spinning. Green lightning arched off her body as she changed direction and slammed both her feet into the Nomu's chest. Eyes widening, Shigaraki stiffened as the beast flew past him and skipped across the water like a stone. Behind his hand mask, a dark smirk crossed his lips. Rushing toward the girl, he didn't even try to dodge the sharpened spearhead. Agony tore through his shoulder as the blade cut through his skin, but that didn't stop him from reaching for her throat. Grabbing his wrist, Izuku snarled as he loomed over her. Her back pressing against the concrete, she flickered her eyes to his. She would tear him apart. Twirling her spear in her hand, she drove it down toward his back. Her hand stopped, the silver blade grazing the back of his shirt. The chuckle that left his lips caused her heart to drop. "What's wrong?" he asked, feigning sympathy. Izuku almost didn't hear him. Her hand was shaking as she tried to force the blade through his unprotected back. Shigaraki watched her eyes flash between gold and green as she tried to kill him. "I'm sorry," Frost whispered. She was barely holding her other half back from murdering the man. Letting Izu become a killer wasn't something she was willing to do. "Damn it, Frost, let go," Izu snarled. She wanted this. Wanted him dead and bleeding at her feet. Chuckling, Shigaraki pressed his hand closer to her throat. The enraged wildfire green that snapped to him. He could see she wanted to rip him to shreds. "What a wild little thing you are," he said, the tone causing her skin to prickle. Both paused as the doors to the USG slammed open. Reacting faster than he could, she moved, her head tilting to the side as she forced his hand to impact the floor under her. Dropping her spear, she kicked upward, sending him flying away from her. Rolling to the side, she looked up, the hardened blue eyes of her teacher meeting hers. Toshinari Yagi was many things, but most of all he was human. The sight of his successor's eyes filled with anguish and pain was enough to make him feel weak. Izuku was a happy girl who didn't allow people to see her weaknesses. Even when she was being bullied, the girl had never complained. Frost had made sure that her other half was safe. But right now he didn't see anything other than a scared little girl. Flickering his eyes to Aizawa, he could feel his knees wanting to crumble. His fellow teacher looked horrible. If only he'd been here when he was supposed to. Then none of this would have happened. Instead, his students were hurt. When he saw the lifeless eyes of his students, something inside him roared. Anger and rage burning in his blood, and driving away the self-hating sorrow he could feel trying to eat him alive. Moving, he grabbed Aizawa before picking up Izuku. Getting them out of danger, he glared at Shigaraki as the Nomu slowly pulled itself out of the water. "Take Aizawa to the entrance and stay there," he ordered. For a moment, he thought Izuku would refuse his orders before she gave a slow nod. Watching Asui rush to Izuku's side, he felt his heart drop as she stumbled slightly, her hand latching around Asui's arm to keep herself standing. The adrenaline leaving her system as she finally realized she was safe. Giving Asui a grateful look, she reached down and laced Aizawa's arm around her shoulder. Lifting him up, she bit her lip to hold back a whine as Asui did the same. The slumped form of their teacher was heavier than she thought he'd be. Once he was sure the two were following his order, Toshi lunged forward, the rage burning through his blood showing in his blue eyes. Izuku watched as her teacher fought the Nomu and found herself feeling dread. He wouldn't be able to win. There just wasn't enough time. He'd already passed his limit and wouldn't be able to hold his form for long. The instant he slammed the creature into the ground, she knew something was wrong. Her entire body was screaming at her to move. Flickering her eyes to her dropped spear, she allowed her eyes to burn gold. Frost would be able to handle everything better than she would. "Asui, take Aizawa," she ordered before moving, cutting her eyes to her classmate. Asui noted the golden eyes and the coldness dripping from her voice. It was different than the burning rage that had overtaken her earlier. Giving a short nod, the girl held her teacher tightly and watched the other girl rush toward the battle. Green lightning arched around her as she bent, grabbing her spear off the ground before jumping, her body twisting in midair as she aimed for the metal around the arm holding Toshi. If she could sever that arm, he would be able to get free. She would be able to save him. Black filled her vision as the warp gate appeared in front of her. Eyes widening, she knew that moving in time wasn't something she would be able to do. "Move, Frost," Katsuki shouted, his voice followed by his actions, his hand crashing onto the armor around Kurogiri's neck and pinning him to the ground. He'd felt her rage and pain through their connection. Landing harshly, Frost rolled to a stop, the solid metal of her spear digging into the ground as she cut her eyes to Shigaraki. She was sure that with both the Nomu and warp gate distracted, she would be able to take him out. Hearing Katsuki snarl, she cut her eyes to his. Glancing at her, he scowled at the coldness in her eyes as Todoroki froze the Nomu in place. Sneering, he turned his attention back to the villain, a warning look on his face as Kurogiri tried to move. He didn't care how it made him look. Blowing up the warp gate would be worth it. Hearing Kirishima complain about messing up, he tightened his grip just a bit. "Move and I'll blow you to hell," he threatened, the words coming out as little more than a growl as Kirishima moved to guard his back. Frost faltered, her eyes going to Shigaraki as he scratched his neck. She could feel Izu snarling for vengeance for Minta. In truth, she understood why her other half wanted him dead, and part of her agreed. Yet, she wouldn't become a murderer just for revenge. It wasn't who she wanted to be. If this gained her Izu's ire, then so be it. Tightening her grip on the spear, she stiffened her body, moving to guard Todoroki as the Nomu moved. "Careful, it can regenerate," she announced. Feeling eyes on her, she pursed her lips. The Nomu stood slowly as it stood beside Shigaraki. "I'll kill him," Izu hissed, the words filling Frost with dread. She didn't know how much of the memory Izu had seen, and she was hoping that the girl would forget it. Most would think that Frost was the dangerous one, but Izuku was the one who lost control. Izu was the dangerous wild animal who howled with rage when injured. Spinning her spear in her hand, Frost snarled, her eyes widening as the Nomu lunged for Katsuki. Kicking off the ground, she tried to get to him first. She didn't get far before the boy was slamming into her, sending them both crashing to the ground. For a moment, she just laid there, her eyes locked on his, before she heard something that made her blood boil. It was the sound of All Might slamming into the wall. Gritting her teeth, she shoved Katsuki off her before standing slowly, the ache in her body slowing her movements. The boy grunted before joining her. She knew he was concerned, but they didn't have time to deal with anything emotional right now. Not when All Might was struggling to remain standing. Katsuki was honestly somewhere between concerned and enraged. On one hand, he knew Frost was actively repressing Izu, so she could stay in control, which almost never happened. He knew that something was wrong, very wrong. On the other hand, he could feel Izuku's rage simmering and powering his own. She was ready to kill someone, most likely the one who'd turned Mainta into a corpse. "Shigaraki is mine," Frost whispered just loud enough he could hear her. Sending her a quick look of worry, he stiffed and looked ready to attack. There was fear in her voice, something that he'd heard from Izu, but never Frost. The wolf was strong and stubborn, but right now she was holding on by a thread, and that worried him more than anything else. Shigaraki was more concerned with the girl than killing All Might. Her rage had been beautiful, and he wanted to see it consume everything around her. Perhaps he should kill another of her friends. The blonde boy seemed close to her. It would be easy to break her if he slaughtered the people she cared for. His grin was hidden by the hands on his face as he thought over his options. He wanted to see her rage like a wounded animal again. Having her pinned beneath him as she struggled to kill him had been the most amusing thing to happen this month. Not counting the number of times his lover had run into the wall in the middle of the night. He had to wonder how she would react if he killed someone closer to her than the boy. Would she rage or break into pieces? Scratching at his neck, he tore his eyes away from the girl as All Might stumbled out of the wall. He was weaker now, which meant he already passed on his power, as Master had hinted too. It would be all too easy to kill him and let the world see how weak their hero really was. "How dare you try to kill my students?" All Might hissed, the tone causing Shigaraki to raise an eyebrow. Looking behind him, he pointed to the slightly warm corpse he'd created just in case the man hadn't noticed. "Kind of late to be worried about that now," he said, his mocking tone earning a low chuckle from Kurogiri, who seemed amused by the entire situation. The snarl that appeared on All Might's face would have been intimidating, if not for the fact the man looked like a strong breeze could blow him over. Glancing over at the girl, he let a laugh fall through his lips, saying, "Besides, that girl was doing the same to me. Why shouldn't I repay the favor?" He would preach about the violence of hero society, but his time was almost up. Flickering his gaze toward the entrance, he frowned. Just a little more time until this farce would be over. Ordering the Nomu to attack, he subtly signaled for Kurogiri to get ready. Crossing his arms, Shigaraki watched the battle between All Might and the Nomu with only half attention. Instead, he focused on the movements of the blonde hero. He was slower now than he was years ago. They could use that against him. Hearing the ceiling break, as the Nomu was sent flying, he shrugged. Watching the man stumble, he let a smirk curve across his lips. Today had gone exactly as planned. Now he just had to finish his act, and possibly kill another child. "Well now, someone seems slower than before," he said, stepping forward. Gritting his teeth, All Might said nothing as the villain mocked him. Something about this man reminded him of All for One, and the similarity was eating at his mind. The villain couldn't have survived their last meeting. There was no way that he'd failed. Yet every time Shigaraki spoke, he could see another in the man's place. "Time to end this," Shigaraki stated. Rushing forward, he cut his eyes to the side as a blur of green rushed to intercept him. Feeling Kurogiri appear beside him, he reacted. Making sure to keep only 4 fingers against her skin, he grabbed the girl's wrist and tugged her through the portal to his side. Looping an arm around her neck, he turned to the entrance as the doors blew off. Frost stilled as his fingers danced across the skin of her wrist in a silent command. Dropping her spear, she was stunned to see the other teachers frozen at the top of the stairs. Feeling a rumble across her back, she heard Shigaraki laugh. A nauseous feeling filled her. He wasn't surprised at all. It was almost like he'd expected all of this. "Let her go," All Might ordered, the rage in his voice audible to everyone around them. "Oh, and if I don't," Shigaraki teased. Glancing at Kurogiri, he chuckled when the man nodded. It was time to leave. Watching All Might threaten and roar at him, the blue-haired man simply wasn't impressed. All it would take was one touch, and he could kill the hero. But he didn't want that. He wanted All Might on his knees in shame as his reputation crumbled to dust. Death was a mercy compared to what he planned for the hero. Pulling the girl closer to him, he smirked when she shivered. Noting her golden eyes, he whispered, "See you soon." Frost yelped as she was shoved forward, her body impacting All Might's. Feeling the man wrap a protective arm around her shoulder, she heard Shigaraki laugh. Sending the hero one last mocking wave, Shigaraki sunk into the portal that opened under him as a bullet impacted the floor where he'd stood a second before. Appearing in the bar, he threw his head back and laughed. "I take it you had fun?" Master asked. The distorted voice coming through the screen was accompanied by the man's blurry image. "Yes, All Might is weak now, and he's already passed off his powers. Discrediting him and tearing his reputation to shreds will be all too easy," he said. The words causing his mentor to chuckle. Moving to the bar, Shigaraki pulled on the black gloves laying on top of it. They were made of a fabric that would neutralize his quirk. Looking over at the screen, he asked, "Did you look into the recruit files I sent?" "Of course, although you'll need to do a lot more than attack children to get them on your side," the words were said slowly. Laughing, Shigaraki gave one last nod as the connection broke, leaving an empty screen. Abruptly cutting off his laughter, Shigaraki turned to Kurogiri. Only one person would have had the foresight to leave out his gloves, and it wasn't the warp gate. Before the man could ask, Kurogiri was creating another portal to the only person Shigaraki cared enough about to see. Stepping into the sunset orange room, he let his eyes trail over the blackened windows and spotless floors to rest on the mirrors decorating the ceiling. Dropping all his masks and facades, the man walked forward to the single bed sitting in the center of the room. Dark orange hair trailed down Kira's neck as he stared upward with unseeing butterscotch eyes. His pupils dating from side to side as he memorized something only he could see. Sitting down slowly, he traced his hands over the 3 delicate marks on the other man's wrist. Eyes clearing, the other man glanced over at him in exasperation, saying, "What if I'd been seeing something important?" "Then you'd tell me about it," he said softly. Hearing the tone, Kira rolled his eyes and sat up. Looking over his blue-haired lover, he sighed and pointed to the bathroom door. "Go get changed while I write down what I saw," he ordered. Chuckling, Shigaraki moved to do what the other man said without fuss. "Frost." Stirring the darkened powder into the milk, Frost stared down at the cup with cloudy eyes. Sitting in the kitchen in the darkened corner, with only a candle, she refused to allow her emotions to get the better of her. Izu was deep in their mind, asleep after crying for at least 2 hours. Letting go of her spoon, she rubbed her forehead, feeling a headache beginning to appear. The tears on her mother's face when she'd walked through the door had been nothing compared to the scream Minta's mother had let out when she learned the news of her son's death. The self-hate and blame coming from Izu when the woman had cursed the school was enough to make her shake in rage. Everything had gone wrong so quickly that she didn't know how to control herself anymore. Aizawa was apparently still in surgery for internal injuries, and Mike hadn't left his side. Glancing at the phone sitting on the table, she sighed again. Exhaustion marring her face. Everything she did was to protect her other half, yet she'd failed. Izu was injured emotionally, and she couldn't do anything to help. Katsuki hadn't even gotten a chance to talk to them before he was dragged away by his mother. At least secluding Izu in their mindscape meant she would be able to keep the nightmares away. Yet it wouldn't keep the pain from eating at her mind. It was all her fault. Watching something drop down onto the table, she was confused before the stinging in her eyes registered in her mind. "Izuku," her mother said. Entering the room, the woman only saw the hunched form of her daughter sitting at the table. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she froze when her daughter turned. The golden eyes filled with tears. Stumbling, she barely had time to realize what was happening before her strongest child was hugging her. Returning the gesture, she ran a hand through her daughter's hair gently. Feeling something soak her shirt, she frowned.